Chapter 862. After New Year's Eve, the bustling scene in the capital city did not diminish, but increased. Before New Year's Eve, the ordinary people in the capital city were busy celebrating the new year. The officials who came from other places did not dare to slack off in the slightest for the first day of the imperial court. After New Year's Eve, they would visit their relatives and friends for a few more days. At the very least, he would leave after the Lantern Festival and tour the capital from top to bottom once. It was no wonder that the foreigners had not seen the world. Today's capital city was changing day by day. It was very different from what they remembered in the past. There were many interesting places, but they could not see enough. In these few days, the big and small shops in the capital city, as well as the peddlers and merchants, made a lot of money. The ready-made clothes and underwear shops were often sold out as soon as the goods were put on display. The brothels were overcrowded every day. If it was only the capital city, the demand for goods would not be so great. Among them, there were many businessmen from other places and even foreign countries. They would transport the goods they bought from the capital city back and resell them to make a profit. This also made Li increasingly feel that he should not stay in the capital city. As long as there was a brothel, the family shops would flourish everywhere. He would not give the black-hearted middlemen a chance to make a profit. Li sat on the bed and carried the little guy who was about to fall back. After 2 months, the little guy became active. He crawled around on the bed and wanted to grab anything he saw. When he cried, his voice became louder. Rui and he were tortured at night. Rui had just coaxed him to sleep in the morning and was forced to the room by Li to rest. After a while, the little guy woke up again. He was full of energy and seemed to be full of energy. Li just sat on the bed and thought about something. The little guy did not know when he fell asleep again. He asked Xiao Huan to come over and look after him. Other than Rui, only Xiao Huan hugged him, and he would not cry no matter how long it took. When he walked out the door, he happened to see the sloppy old man limping in from the outside. Although Su was older, he was still a guru. The number of people in the world who could hurt him could be counted on one hand. It was even more impossible for him to sprain his ankle while walking. It was because he had made some progress in martial arts recently. It seemed that he had made a small breakthrough in his realm, so he excitedly challenged his second granduncle. After he came out of the courtyard, he became like this. Li looked at him and said, "Su should rest at home today. I'll ask Fang to go out with me." The old man was already in such a state, yet he still wanted to trouble him to accompany him. It would be suspicious if he was abusing the old man. It doesn't matter. The sloppy old man shook his head and said, "The path of martial arts has always been bumpy. This small injury is nothing." He leaped up and landed steadily on the carriage. The sloppy old man glanced at him and said with some surprise, "You've made some progress recently?" Li lifted the curtain, turned around, and said with a smile, "I ate well, slept well, and was in a good mood. I accidentally entered a little. There was never a lack of topics in the capital city. As the people under the feet of the emperor, the people of the capital city had pride and confidence that people in other places did not have. They cared about the state affairs, the gossip of the officials and nobles in the capital city, whether the soldiers on the front line had enough to eat, and they were also curious about how the third master of the Chui family was better than the first master of the Chui family. Especially for some people who had a strong sense of national pride, although they were just ordinary people, they cared about the country no less than the officials in the court. However, it was also because they were only ordinary people who could not participate in the state affairs that some news could not be obtained. Therefore, the brothel became the favorite place for these people. In the past 2 days, the contents of the stargazing meeting that had been widely spread were what people were most interested in. On the stage, an old storyteller was describing with great emotion how His Highness had wittily dealt with the imperial astronomer that night, and how the wronged imperial astronomer had pestered him endlessly. Below the stage, many people were intoxicated by the story, and there were also people who lowered their heads in disgust and whispers. A young man said in surprise, "What? 2 pieces of silver with a huge difference in weight fell from the same height and fell to the ground at the same time. Shouldn't the heavier one fall first? This is too unimaginable." A young man beside him smiled and said, "If this brother doesn't believe it, you can take out 2 pieces of silver and try it. You will immediately know whether what he said is true or false." "Brother, what you said is reasonable." The young man nodded and took out an ingot of silver and a silver fragment from his waist. He stood up, raised them to the same height, and let go at the same time. The 2 pieces of silver fell too fast, and he could not see which one fell first. But this was far from what he had imagined, that the silver ingot should fall earlier than the silver fragment. An expression of disbelief appeared on his face. "It's actually true." The young man beside him picked up the 2 pieces of silver on the ground and put them in his bosom. He said, "Although it's a little unimaginable, seeing is believing. We have always been wrong." "Yes, I didn't expect that we would be wrong for so many years when we could easily verify the truth." The young man nodded and sighed inwardly. He then looked at him with a frown. "That's my silver." "What yours?" "I clearly picked it up." In another restaurant, a green-robed scholar was talking loudly, attracting the attention of the onlookers in the restaurant. "What stargazing meeting? They actually said that the earth under our feet is a big ball. This is ridiculous, a bunch of nonsense." The green-robed scholar spoke passionately. He drank a cup of wine and said again, "The heavenly dog swallows the sun, and the heavenly dog swallows the moon. The sages have long explained this. Could it be that we scholars have been reading the sages' books all along have been wrong? Since ancient times, there has never been a woman in charge of the government. She abandoned the moral principles and ignored them. That's why there are bewilderment guarding the heart and warning the celestial phenomena. Now, someone actually wants to use such a twisted theory to cover up the past. What is his motive? What is his motive? If Her Majesty insists on doing this, the country will fall. The country will fall." We scholars. In the restaurant, some people listened excitedly, some people looked thoughtful, and some people's eyes flashed with suspicion. Fong drank a mouthful of wine and said angrily, "Young master, this guy is full of nonsense. Why don't you arrest him and put him in prison?" He shook his head and did not speak. The sloppy old man tore a chicken leg and said lightly, "The Jing Kingdom does not convict people based on words. The emperor is muddle-headed, and the officials and the people can be scolded. These scholars are the most united. If you arrest one of them, countless more will appear. In this way, the world will be in chaos." Fong slapped the table and said, "Is there no way to deal with him?" As soon as he finished speaking, there was a noise at the door. "Hey, where did the beggar come from? You can't go in here. I want to find my husband. My husband is inside." "What do you mean by your husband? Go, go, go. I'll give you a bun. Go quickly. My husband will be the top scholar in the future." "I want to see him, top scholar." The waiter was slightly stunned when he heard the ragged woman's words. The woman took this opportunity to break in. She quickly walked to the green-robed scholar, grabbed his sleeve, and said excitedly, "Husband, I finally found you." She pulled out a 5 or 6-year-old girl behind her and quickly said, "Young man, hurry up and greet Daddy." Chapter 863. The little girl raised her head and looked at the young man. She blinked her big, watery eyes and said timidly, "Daddy." The scholar in cyan shirt was talking with his saliva flying everywhere. He had already thought that after this matter, he would probably have a way to become an official. He was stunned by the sudden scene in front of him. When he came to his senses, he saw the ragged woman pulling his sleeve. He immediately waved his hand in disgust and said angrily, "You must have mistaken me for someone else. Who is your husband?" The woman pushed the messy hair off her forehead and said hurriedly, "Husband, don't you know me? I'm Yang Yang." The young scholar's face changed. Was it really a love affair that he had gotten into on his way to school? But he couldn't remember when he had a love affair with this woman named Yang Yang. Now he had a family, and his wife's family had some power in the capital city. Usually, he relied on his father-in-law to help him. Even if he really had a love affair with her, he couldn't admit it at this time. He suddenly shook his sleeve and said loudly, "I don't know you. You must have mistaken me for someone else." The woman was stunned and looked at him in a daze. The excitement on her face gradually disappeared, and her face turned gray. In order to find you, I took young man on the road for a year. When we finally arrived at the capital city, young man was seriously ill. If it weren't for a kind-hearted person, she would have. She said in a desolate voice, I know you. You already have a family in the capital city. I won't disturb you anymore. I will raise young man alone. The little girl looked up at the young scholar with tears in her big eyes. Mother, father doesn't want us anymore. The woman wiped away her tears and said, Young man, I mistook you for someone else. Let's go. I'll take you to find your real father. After saying that, she took the little girl's hand and left without looking back. In the restaurant, the young scholar stood there in a daze. Looking at the disgust in the eyes of the people around him, he opened his mouth, but in the end, he didn't say anything and left gloomily. He looks like a dog, but I didn't expect him to be such a cruel and unscrupulous person. She's just like Chinshimi from the drama. I thought that story only existed in dramas. I didn't expect abandoning his wife and son, yet he is still a scholar. Does he deserve to be called a scholar? He only knows how to read the book of the sage. Is that all the sage taught him? That woman is so pitiful. Her words just now clearly showed that she had already given up all hope. It's really a pity for this mother and son. After the azure-robed scholar left, the people in the restaurant became filled with righteous indignation. In their hearts, the words of a scholar still carried some weight. These people read the book of the sage and preached great principles. However, what principles could a beast in human attire, who could even abandon his wife and son, say? One of them shook his head and said, Her Royal Highness has never paid attention to such slander. Her Royal Highness only cares about the people of our Jing country. These days, how many new laws have been implemented, how many people can afford to eat, and how many people can afford to study. They don't even think about how much their wives and children have received from Her Royal Highness. These people are cruel and unscrupulous. Another person said indignantly, If this is a jinx, then I hope that there will be more jinxes like this in our Jing nation. In the restaurant, many people revealed ashamed expressions. Just now, when they heard that heartless and unscrupulous person speak so eloquently, they almost believed him. Among them, how many of them had benefited from Her Highness? Not only did they not repay her kindness, but they even helped some people with ulterior motives to slander her. This was ungrateful, Abba. Fong spat out a chicken bone and scolded, Scum! Then, a puzzled expression appeared on his face, and he asked, Son-in-law, do you feel that the woman just now is a little familiar? Not very familiar. Li Yi nodded, stood up, and said, Let's go and have a look at other places. At the entrance of a tea house, the waiter stopped Li Yi and the other two people and said with a smile, Sir, this place is booked by someone today. Casually catching an ingot of silver that Fong threw over, the waiter immediately smiled brightly and said, Sir, please come in. There were many figures in the tea house. Most of them were young people dressed like scholars. They were probably holding a poetry meeting or something like that. Some were writing, while others were commenting loudly. Now that the emperor is ill, the Eastern Palace is empty, and women are in power, the rules are in chaos. The weather is warning us, but the court is ignoring it. I really don't know where the future of our Jing kingdom lies, someone in the tea house frowned. Today, everyone was making friends through literature. Although the young people were full of ambition, it was inevitable that they would discuss the affairs of the country. However, the matter of Ing Hua guarding his heart had already been concluded. The imperial astronomer had made disrespectful remarks about Her Highness the Princess and intended to bring chaos to the court. He had already taken the blame and resigned. Almost all the officials in the court had seen Ing Hua with their own eyes. What was the intention of this scholar with the surname Wang to make such remarks at this time? The people of my generation who study. The scholar with the surname Wang had only just started his sentence when he was interrupted by a voice. A plump woman with heavy makeup barged in from outside. Behind her were a few sturdy men. She scolded, Bullsh**T scholars. Don't you scholars have to pay when you visit prostitutes? The scholar with the surname Wang's expression changed. He quickly walked forward and whispered, "Didn't I say that in 2 days? Bah!" The old brothel keeper waved her hand and said angrily, "It's only right and proper to pay when visiting prostitutes. It's not easy for us to open our doors to do business. If you don't pay today, I'll drag you to see the officials." The scholar with the surname Wang couldn't care less about the current situation. He quickly said in a low voice, 2 days, just 2 days, you don't have money?" The old brothel keeper glanced at him and waved her hand. "Take him to see the officials." The few sturdy men behind her immediately rushed forward. The scholar with the surname Wang was quickly taken away, leaving the people in the tea house looking at each other in dismay. Scholars have been dissolute since ancient times. Visiting a brothel was nothing much. It could even be considered an elegant thing. However, visiting a brothel without paying was a bit too much. This kind of immoral person, TSK. It was not worth associating with. He took a sip of tea. The tricks played by the Chui family were too obvious and too straightforward. There was no technical content at all. However, in terms of effectiveness, if the power of the brothel was not involved, there would really be some trouble. These scholars had always been the most provocative group. Their influence could not be underestimated. Fortunately, that Grand Tutor Chu did not collude with the Chui family this time. Otherwise, the matter would have become much more troublesome. When he came out of the tea house and was about to go to the brothel, he once again saw the young scholar he had met in the restaurant. He sat paralyzed in front of a tall mansion door and cried, "Wife, believe me, I really don't know them. This is a false accusation, a false accusation." A servant girl threw out a bag from inside and said in disgust, "Miss said to get lost far away. The next time I see you in the capital, I'll get someone to break your legs." After saying this, the mansion door closed with a bang. "Serve you right." Fong spat fiercely at the young man who had lost his soul. Those who are loyal are always those who butcher dogs, but those who are heartless are always those who are scholars. He shook his head and sighed. Soon, he walked to a brothel. A young girl who was biting on a tonghulu ran out and said happily, "Big brother, you're here." Li patted her head and said with a smile, "Young man, did you listen to Sister watching today?" The young girl nodded vigorously. Young man has always been very obedient. She even performed on stage yesterday. Chapter 864. Fuma, take a closer look. It says that Qin Xianglian is 32 years old and is suing the emperor's son-in-law, deceiving the king, deceiving the emperor, breaking off the marriage, killing his wife and son, losing his conscience. On the stage, an old man was singing passionately, and the audience was listening attentively. This was a new play that had been released not long ago. It was called The Case of the Beautiful Guillotine. It was about a heartless scholar who became the Zhuangyuan and was recruited as the prince consort. He abandoned his first wife, and, for the sake of riches and fortune, he wanted to kill his wife and son. As soon as this play was released, it became very popular in the capital. The fictional character of Justice, Bao, was no stranger to them. This story of how he didn't fear power and justice for the people and killed the wicked was very satisfying. It was exactly the kind of play that ordinary people living at the bottom of society like to watch. At this critical juncture, if there really was a heartless person who abandoned his wife and son for the sake of wealth and honor, he would probably be stabbed in half by the audience. In the private room upstairs, Miss Zeng wiped away her tears and looked at Li Yi with some bitterness. "Why did you come up with this play?" Needless to say, she, who was overflowing with sympathy, naturally sympathized with Qin Xianglian and her son. Wan Ruoqing was used to such scenes. She had seen this play countless times, from the script to the arrangement to the introduction of the stage. Naturally, she would not be touched at this time. She smiled and said, "This is just a play. If it wasn't so complicated and bizarre to stir people's emotions, not many customers would be willing to watch it." Zheng Zumo looked at her and curled her lips. "You only know how to speak up for him." Wan Ruoqing could only shake her head and smile. He looked at the goddess of Luo Shui and defended himself. Art comes from life, but it is higher than life. Although it is a play, it also reflects the reality of society. Today, when I was eating in the restaurant, I saw a real-life Chunshimi. You are too naive and don't understand the ugliness of this world. He thought of something and said, "Oh, right, if you have the chance, help me thank the madam of the Jade Courtyard. If it wasn't for her this time, there might have been some trouble. She has never been someone who likes to suffer losses." Zhang Zumo shook her head and said, "I came here this morning to talk about the conditions. The new styles of the lingerie workshop will be supplied to them first. These were all unimportant matters." After the failure of the Imperial Astronomer, the Chui clan was still too naive to think that they could use these scholars to stir up the storm. They were but a plate of loose sand, and their usefulness was very limited. He just didn't know what kind of tricks they would use next time after they failed again. It wasn't that they hadn't considered solving the problem once and for all. However, how could a family that had existed for hundreds of years in the Jing Kingdom fall so easily? At the very least, he needed a heavy primer. Trash. All of you are trash. In a hall of the Chui clan, a row of young scholars knelt down. The head of the Chui clan, Chui Qingze, could no longer suppress the anger in his heart. His expression was ferocious, and he roared incessantly. The people kneeling in the hall lowered their heads, not even daring to breathe loudly. All the arrangements he had made, without exception, had failed. They didn't even stir up the slightest ripple. On the contrary, because of these things, the public opinion of the people had been completely reversed. In this invisible confrontation, the Chui clan had once again suffered a crushing defeat. Standing to the side, Chui Qingming looked at the trembling people, waved his hand, and said, "All of you leave." As if they had been granted amnesty, they hurriedly got up from the ground and disappeared from the hall in an instant. Chui Qingze's whole body slumped on the chair. His eyes were lifeless, and his expression was dispirited. "Big brother." Chui Qingming had just opened his mouth when he was interrupted. Chui Qingze stared blankly ahead and murmured, "Qingming, do you think we're getting further and further away from that path?" Chui Qingming clenched his fists and said through gritted teeth, "Her Highness is still here, and His Highness is still here. We haven't lost, and the Chui clan hasn't lost. We lost miserably yesterday. Chu Ping, you're the only one who won the most. No matter what, you have to pay for today's match, right?" In the Miaoying Pavilion, a young man put his arm around another young man's shoulder and said with a smile, "Of course." Chu Ping nodded and then said in a low voice, "However, you mustn't let my grandfather know that we went to the gambling house." Chui Shixin patted him on the chest and said, "Of course we know that. Don't worry, if the Grand Tutor finds out, won't we also be punished?" Only then did Chu Ping relax. He touched the banknotes in his bosom and felt a burst of joy in his heart. The Chu family had a strict upbringing. Although he was the eldest son of the first wife, because of this, the elders were even stricter with him. Previously, he had traveled with his grandfather to broaden his horizons. Now that he had returned to the capital and was accompanied by his friends, he finally realized that there were so many fun things in this world. Come, let's go in first." Chui Shixin waved his hand and pointed at Qinyu, who was at the side. As he walked, he said, "I heard from Junliang that you also like that kind of thing, Chu Ping. You can talk more with little Duke Qin about this. I believe you will learn a lot from him." Chu Ping's face reddened, and he hurriedly said, "Let's go in and talk." A well-rounded woman came out from inside and smiled. "Oh my, young masters, you came at such a good time today. Lady Shuang is preparing to perform in the heavenly room upstairs." Chu Ping asked in confusion, "Lady Shuang?" Chui Shixin smiled and explained, "Lady Shuang's zither skills are the best in the wonderful sound pavilion. If you go up and listen, you'll know. You have a deep understanding of the zither. Perhaps you can even compare notes with Lady Shuang. The wonderful sound pavilion was one of the more famous music halls in the capital. Normally, there was an endless stream of customers. The group went up to the second floor. Under the guidance of the beautiful woman, they entered the heavenly room. The room was very spacious, and there were many small rooms inside. There were bead curtains hanging from the outside, forming a ring around the stage in the middle. At this time, there was already a woman on the stage. She was about 16 or 17 years old and was very charming and lovely. However, her face was a bit pale. At first glance, she gave off a feeling of weakness. Whenever a man saw her appearance, he couldn't help but want to take her into his arms and take good care of her. Cui Shixin stretched out his hand and waved it in front of Chu Ping's eyes. He smiled and said, "Hey, what are you looking at? You're staring straight." "No, nothing." Chu Ping's face reddened, and he lowered his head in a panic. "Could it be that this lady Shuang Shuang is your type?" Cui Shixin looked at him in astonishment and said, "Last time Jun Liang told me, I didn't believe it. So it turns out that you really do like this sickly appearance, but..." He shook his head with a bit of pity. "But what?" Chu Ping immediately raised his head. "This lady Shuang Shuang is a good woman. It is said that her family isn't very well off, and her body is also very weak. She only occasionally plays a song here. I'm afraid you'll be disappointed this time." Cui Shixin's words contained a bit of regret that was difficult to conceal. Although the wonderful Sound Pavilion was a music hall, it was also a business of secret prostitution. Of course, this place was naturally of a much higher class than the brothels outside. There were also simple musicians, and this lady Shuang Shuang was one of them. His tone changed, and he said again, "A fair and graceful lady is a gentleman's desire. If you, Chu Ping, really like her, then boldly pursue her. With the Chu family's noble status, it is not impossible for you to obtain Lady Shuang Shuang's heart." At this moment, the sound of the zither rang out. Chu Ping closed his eyes and listened attentively for a while. Then he opened his eyes and said in admiration, "Lady Shuang Shuang's zither skills can already be considered a master." Cui Shixin patted his shoulder and said, "Don't be sad. In a moment, I'll arrange another one for you. Isn't she just the sickly type? As long as you have money, you can find anything. However, don't even think about the one who let us in just now. That's young Duke Qin's." Chu Ping looked at the beautiful woman from just now and immediately shook his head. He sighed in his heart. This young Duke Qin's preferences were truly unique. Chapter 865. Inside the Heaven Room. The music of the zither was pleasing to the ears. Aside from this music, there was no other noise. After all, those who could come here to listen to music were at least semi-refined people. They wouldn't do something like burning the zither and cooking the crane. Cui Shixin saw Chu Ping staring at the zither playing woman in a daze. He smiled and whispered, "If you really like it, how about tonight?" Chu Ping repeatedly shook his head and said, "No, no, no, this absolutely cannot be done." "You must not." Cui Shixin waved his hand and said, "I was just saying. Don't worry. How could we dare to help you do such a thing? If the Grand Tutor were to find out, it would be terrible. What kind of people are you talking about? Don't think that I don't know what kind of place your wonderful Sound Pavilion is." An abrupt voice suddenly sounded from one of the compartments. The beautiful woman from before was pushed out from the inside. She said with a troubled expression, "Customer, we cannot agree to your request." Slap. A middle-aged man swayed out from inside and slapped the beautiful woman's face. He scolded, "You're a whore, and you still want to maintain chastity? Don't be so shameless." A man pulled the middle-aged man and said, Fifth Lord, you've drunk too much. Let's go back." "I didn't drink too much." The middle-aged man waved his hand and pointed at the delicate woman on the stage. He said that, "Lady Shuang Shuang, come down and drink a cup of wine with Fifth Lord. Fifth Lord is in a good mood today. If you make Fifth Lord happy, you will be heavily rewarded." The woman stood up from the stage and ran to the beautiful woman's side in a panic. She helped her up and asked with concern, "Annan, are you all right?" "I'm fine." The beautiful woman covered her face, but she still smiled at the middle-aged man and said, "Guest, Shuang Shuang is truly a pure woman. If you like her, I can find another." The middle-aged man slapped her again and drunkenly said, "I'm giving you face, but you don't want it." The woman quickly pushed the beautiful woman behind her and said in panic, I'll drink with you. The middle-aged man revealed a smile and reached out to touch her small face. That's more obedient. The woman didn't expect him to be so touchy. She subconsciously dodged and whispered, "You, please behave yourself." The middle-aged man's face instantly darkened. He slapped her face again and said angrily, "You refuse a toast only to drink a forfeit. Do you know who I am?" The young girl's body was thin and weak to begin with. After receiving such a heavy slap, she staggered and almost fell to the ground. When she raised her head, her eyes were filled with tears, and there was a trace of blood at the corner of her mouth and the surrounding cubicles. Figures started to walk out one after another. Usually, the majority of those who had such an interest were naturally young people. Moreover, they were young and full of vigor. When they saw injustice, they would always stand up and speak out. Immediately, many people had resentful expressions on their faces as they walked over. A figure was the fastest. After running over, he first helped the woman up and asked with concern, "Miss, are you all right?" The woman looked at him and nodded gratefully. "Thank you, young master, I'm fine." "And who are you?" The middle-aged man seemed to be angered by the scene in front of him. He reached out to pull the young man's shoulder, but his wrist was caught midway. Scram! Chinyu suddenly swung his hand and looked at the middle-aged man in front of him. The middle-aged man staggered and looked at the young man in front of him. His expression suddenly changed, and he seemed to have sobered up. He blurted out, "Why are you here?" Chinyu didn't even look at him and said lightly, "I'll count to 3. If you don't scram, I'll get someone to help you." The middle-aged man's expression changed again, and he said in a low voice, "This is outside. You should at least give me some face and leave some face for the Chin family. 3. I'm your 5th uncle. 2. You don't even care about the Chin family's face. 1. The middle-aged man didn't move, but the big man behind him suddenly carried him and quickly ran to the stairs. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared in front of everyone. Chu Ping looked at Chinyu in disbelief and murmured, "This, boring." Chinyu waved his hand and said, "You guys have fun. I'll leave first." Chu Ping was stunned for a moment. Then he looked at the woman and asked with concern, "Are you okay?" The delicate woman bowed to him and said gratefully, "Thank you for saving me just now, young master." "I can't thank you enough." Chu Ping looked at her face and hurriedly said, "You're bleeding. Quickly go and apply some medicine." The beautiful woman squeezed out a smile and said, "Thank you for today's matter, young masters. Please sit here for a while. I'll let Shuang Shuang come out later to properly thank you, young masters. The song just now was not finished." After such a thing happened, the beautiful woman quickly arranged for a musician to replace it. However, the people who had already sat back in their rooms didn't have much mood to enjoy it. In a compartment somewhere, someone said in surprise, "The one who used alcohol to act crazy was the Chin family's 5th master?" A person nodded and said, "He just called himself young Duke Chin's 5th uncle. It should be true." That person was puzzled. Then why did Chin's 5th master treat him? The person who just answered looked at him in surprise and asked, "You don't know?" That person was even more puzzled. "What do I know?" After a while, after listening to his companion next to him explain what had happened, he opened his eyes wide and said in disbelief, "No way. After doing such an immoral thing, he can actually act like this." Someone who knew the situation shook his head and said, "This matter caused a great stir in the capital city. Even the Chin family couldn't suppress it. Later, it should be the Chui family and His Highness King of Shu who helped to suppress the matter with great difficulty. In that case, this Chin family's 5th master can be considered a pitiful person." That person showed a look of pity and said, "This is simply a great shame. He must hate the Chin family, the Chui family, and His Highness King of Shu to death. What's the use of hating him? What can he do? Among these people, who can he afford to offend?" Someone sighed and said, "It is also because of this matter that this Chin family's 5th master only knows how to drink and have fun all day, drowning his sorrows in alcohol. At first, he went to the brothel every day, but recently, he seems to like going to the brothel to watch the shows. After suffering such a great shame, he can still appear in front of everyone openly. He can be considered an anomaly." The one who just stood up seems to be the young master of the Chu family. As expected of someone taught by old Chu, in another room, Chu Ping asked worriedly, "Qin Yu, he treated his elders like this. Is he okay?" Cui Shixin waved his hand and said, "This is nothing. He has done things 10 times or even 100 times worse than this. You don't have to worry." He looked at Chu Ping with a smile and said, "How does it feel to be a hero saving the beauty?" Chu Ping showed an embarrassed expression. At the door, Lady Shuang Shuang, who had changed her clothes, had already lifted the curtain and slowly walked in. She bowed to the few people and said softly, "This little girl thanks the few young masters for saving me just now." Cui Shixin pushed Chu Ping, who was stunned in place, and said with a smile, "What are you waiting for? Help the lady up, put me down." In a certain alley, a middle-aged man patted the shoulder of a big man who was running wildly and said indifferently. The big man panted and said, "Fifth Master, a wise man does not fight when the odds are against him. A gentleman's revenge is never too late. Put me down." "Oh." The big man stopped and put down the middle-aged man he was carrying on his shoulder. The middle-aged man looked at him and asked, "Am I a joke?" The big man was startled and suddenly shook his head. "Fifth Master, you must be joking. Who dares to say that you are a joke? Hit me." "Ah." The big man's eyes widened. "Hurry up, hit me." The middle-aged man looked at him and said expressionlessly, "Just like what I did to the lady just now." The big man reached out and touched the middle-aged man's forehead and said with some worry, "Fifth Master, how about I take you to see a doctor? Do as I say, or I will deduct 1 month's salary." Slap! The big man swung his arm and slapped the middle-aged man's face. The middle-aged man staggered and stood up with the help of the wall. He looked at the big man with a sullen face and asked, "Did I hit you that hard just now? Very hard?" The big man scratched his head and said with an apologetic smile, "I'm sorry, Fifth Master. How about we try again?" Chapter 866. The period from the Spring Festival to the Lantern Festival was the busiest time of the year for the brothel. Li sat in front of the window of the small building, writing the latest plays. The reason why the brothel could be so popular was because of the endless wonderful stories and the essence of the culture of the Huaxia people for thousands of years in his mind. Obviously, the old-fashioned scripts from the brothel could not meet the needs of the people. Wan Ruoqing pushed the door open and came in with a food box in her hand. She said softly, "I've been busy all morning. I cooked some porridge. Have some." "It's okay. Put it there. I'll eat it after I finish writing this part." Li raised his head and said, but his stomach was growling. He hadn't eaten anything since morning, so he was really hungry. However, there was not much left to write. He didn't want to be interrupted in the middle, which would be troublesome. Wan Ruoqing came over with the food box, took out the bowl of porridge, and sat beside him. She said, "Eat some first. The script is not urgent." Li didn't say anything this time. He picked up the spoon with one hand, and the other hand was not idle. He drank a mouthful of porridge, wrote a line of words, and then drank another mouthful. He was thinking about whether it was suitable to use a certain plot here. The spoon in his left hand gradually stopped in the air. Then a soft hand took the spoon from his hand and brought the spoonful of porridge to his mouth. Wan Ruoqing smiled and said, "You can't do 2 things at once. Let me do it." Li smiled awkwardly and said, "I'm sorry. Only a hedonistic young master from a wealthy family could enjoy such treatment. It was too extravagant and depraved." In order to express his uneasiness and apology, Li decided to write another 20% discount. Only then would he be able to gain some peace of mind. Li swallowed the porridge she fed him and asked casually, "How are the children recently? These days they are learning something from the old people in the brothel." Wan Ruoqing nodded and said, "It's not a good idea to keep doing cleaning work. Learn more, and you can support yourself in the future. It's up to them whether to stay in the brothel or choose other jobs." Li felt that this was a good idea. Although they were all children, there were still some very talented ones among them. They grew up in a brothel, so their feelings for this place were naturally extraordinary. If they were trained well, They might be entrusted with important tasks in the future. Then, they talked about the brothel. Although the script couldn't be finished, the porridge would eventually be finished. When Ruaching put down the bowl, there was no point in continuing. He stood up, stretched his body, and said, "Let's go for a walk." Juan Ruaching nodded slightly. Even though there were many things to do in the brothel before the Lantern Festival, what could be better than two people walking together? Of course, Li knew that even if it was just the two of them walking together, she would be happy for the whole day. But he didn't know that as soon as he walked downstairs, he met someone he didn't want to meet now, especially at this time. The new capital governor, Lord Zeng, was dressed in casual clothes and didn't have any attendants around him. In the brothel where people came and went, it was easy to be lost in the crowd. Zhang Shichen stood opposite, looked at him, and said, "Drunk Ink said you were here." Of course, Drunk Ink knew that he was here. He came from Willow Lane. Li looked at him and asked tentatively, "What's the matter?" "What's the matter?" meant that if you have something to say it quickly or leave quickly. "Didn't you see that I have important things to do here? Don't you know that it's not appropriate for you to appear now? Can't you change the time?" Obviously, Lord Zeng didn't understand what he meant. He said, "This is not the place to talk." Wan Ruaching showed a slight smile on her face and said, "Lord, come in and talk." He shook his head and walked into the small building again. Zhang Shichen picked up the teacup on the table and took a sip before saying, "I've already ordered people to renovate that house. Too much time has passed, and it can't be exactly the same as it was 10 years ago, but it should be 70 to 80% similar. Drunking's birthday is in April, so time is tight." Li nodded and said, "A few days ago, Louis found some suspicious points in the files of the Ministry of Justice. However, it was a case from 13 years ago after all. It has been a long time, and the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue died on the way to exile. There are many clues that are hard to verify. However, this is not a difficult matter for him. He should be able to make it in time." Zhang Shichen looked up at him and asked, "A few days ago, there were rumors about the eldest princess among the people. You should know who did it, right?" Li shook his head and said, "Summoning the king of Shu back to the capital to replace the eldest princess in governing the country. Naturally, it will be whoever benefits the most. Chui Qingze, the head of the Chui family, has fallen ill." Zhang Shichen put down the teacup and said, "Now the head of the Chui family is the second son of the Chui family, Chui Qingming. This person is more difficult to deal with than Chui Qingze. He has always been ruthless and will do anything, even disregarding the consequences. You should be careful." He looked at Li and said, "Don't think that the Chui family only has this little ability. This time, the crown prince has disbanded the imperial astronomer, and the Chui family's rumor campaign has also been stalled among the people. Although I don't know what you are thinking, I think you don't want the king of Shu to return to the capital and replace the eldest princess in governing the country. Not to mention other things, if Grand Tutor Chu takes the lead this time, it will not be so easy to solve this matter. Grand Tutor Chu will stand up for the Chui family." He actually had a good impression of this Grand Tutor Chu. The old man did not seem to be as pedantic as he imagined, and this time he did not stand with the Chui family to make things difficult. If it was really as Zhang Shichen said, then the matter would really become troublesome. Zhang Shichen shook his head and said, "According to the Grand Tutor's temperament, he won't." His tone changed and he said, "I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" Zhang Shichen shook his head again and said, "I think I'm overthinking. In short, the Chui family will not let this matter go easily. You must be careful." Li nodded and said, "I know." In his heart, he had never underestimated the Chui family. Some extreme measures were not to be used until the last moment. It was better to take things step by step. After that, Zhang Shichen only cared about drinking tea and did not say anything else. Li suppressed some of his thoughts and thought about the walk with Ruaching. Seeing that Lord Sung did not seem to have any intention of leaving, he asked tentatively, "Lord Sung, would you like to stay and have a meal?" Generally speaking, when visiting someone's house at the last minute and hearing the host's invitation to stay, one should decline and stand up to say goodbye. This was an invisible tacit understanding between people. However, as soon as the words left his mouth, he regretted it, because historical experience showed that he and Lord Sung did not have this kind of tacit understanding. As expected, Sung Shichen put down his teacup and raised his head. Okay. After the family banquet, when Chu Ping was helping Grand Tutor Chu back to their room, he suddenly asked, "Grandfather, when will the next time we go out?" "I'm old and can't walk anymore," Grand Tutor Chu said, then raised his eyes to look at him and asked, "What? You don't like the capital and want to go out?" "No." Chu Ping repeatedly shook his head. Although the outside world is more knowledgeable, the capital also has its advantages. Grand Tutor Chu nodded and said, "These years outside, you've already seen many things. What you need now is to calm your heart and settle down. Don't follow those people outside and fool around, I know." Chu Ping repeatedly nodded and said, "I'm not fooling around. It's just that my zither skills have improved recently, and I often go to the music hall to listen to music." "All right." After returning to their room, Grand Tutor Chu waved his hand and said, "The Lantern Festival is approaching. You can relax a little. You can go." Chu Ping helped Grand Tutor Chu to his bed and said, "Grandfather, rest well. I'll take my leave." Miaoying Pavilion, Lady Shuang Shuang. In the Chui family, Chui Qingming stood in front of the door and looked into the distance. Chapter 867. Yes, Father, Chu Ping is very interested in that Lady Shuang Shuang. Chui Shixin said, then shook his head and said, "However, that Lady Shuang Shuang is different from those prostitutes. She has a clean background. It seems that she only has gratitude for Chu Ping and has no ambiguous intentions." "Clean background?" Chui Qingming smiled somewhat mockingly and said, "I've seen many clean girls." "Where did you see so many clean girls?" A voice suddenly sounded from the side. Chui Qingming turned around and said in surprise, "Madam, how did you—" The beautiful woman's face was cold, and she asked, "Tell me, where did you see them?" Chui Qingming hemmed and hawed, "This matter, come in." The beautiful woman reached out and dragged him into the room, and the door was slammed shut. Chui Shixin stood at the door, shook his head, and retreated into the courtyard. After the time it took to drink a cup of tea, the door was pushed open again. Chui Qingming walked out of the room, straightened his clothes, and said, "Today, go and meet that Lady Shuang Shuang in secret. In this world, there is no such thing as a girl with a clean background. As long as you promise her benefits, there will always be a condition for her to give up her innocence." A trace of doubt appeared on Chui Shixin's face. "Father, you mean—" Chui Qingming whispered a few words, and Chui Shixin showed a look of understanding. He nodded and said, "I understand. There are 2 more days to go to the Upper Yuan dynasty. Be careful, don't overreach yourself." Chui Qingming warned him again, then walked out of the courtyard and ordered a servant standing outside. "Prepare the carriage, go to the capital governor's mansion. The Upper Yuan dynasty of your Jing kingdom is really lively." Even though she had already experienced the prosperity of the capital, the scene of the Upper Yuan dynasty still made Lin Wanru marvel. The crowded streets, the lanterns that could be seen everywhere, the acrobatic performances on the streets, the fireworks that bloomed in the night sky, and the delicacies that lined both sides of the streets. She had spent several times in the capital of Qi, but what she had seen and heard back then could not be compared to what she was seeing here. If they had not seen it with their own eyes, none of the people from the Qi kingdom would have believed that the Jing kingdom, which they had always regarded as their weak neighbor, had far surpassed them in some aspects. Rui tilted her head to look at her and said with a smile, "If Sister Lin likes the capital, you can stay here for a few more days." The 2 girls in front were talking while Li Yi held onto Yong Ning and the proud Loli's hands to prevent them from getting lost in the crowd. Although there were countless palace guards and experts from the Lu Alliance in the crowd, he still had to be prepared. He didn't bring the little fellow out today, so he didn't sleep for the whole day. According to his usual practice, he would sleep until tomorrow morning. Passing by a Tonghalu stall, Li bought a few skewers of assorted Tonghalu, gave one each to Xiao Huan. Yong Ning and proud Lolita turned his head to look at Mississippi Lou, asked, "Want one?" Childish. Mississippi Lou glanced at him, expressed her disdain, and picked a bunch of grapes. There were not many opportunities for a family to come out together like this, especially when it was such a lively occasion. It only happened 3 or 4 times a year. Just as he told them to be careful when eating the candied hawthorn and not to hurt themselves, an extremely rough voice came from behind. "Get out of the way! Get out of the way! The Capitol Yamen is arresting a criminal of the Imperial Court. Get out of the way! All of you get out of the way!" Several constables in Yamen uniform rushed over from behind. Their movements were extremely rough, and many people were pushed down by them, but they could only curse their bad luck and didn't dare to show it. A man who looked like a constable was pressed down on his shoulder before he could push Lee. The constable frowned and scolded, "Bastard, your eyes are on your buttocks. Can't you see that the constables are handling a case? Get out of the way. Can you bear the responsibility if you make a mistake?" As soon as he finished speaking, he felt something hard pressed against his waist. "Are your dog eyes blind?" Then a soft and feminine voice reached his ears. For them, working for the Yamen, no matter if it was a man's or a woman's voice, they had nothing to fear. But this kind of voice that was neither male nor female was the most terrifying. If they heard this kind of voice on the street, it meant that there was some important person in the palace here. And no matter who it was in the palace, it was not someone they, including their prefectural magistrate, could afford to offend. The constable shivered and immediately said, "Forgive me, forgive me. We are only following the imperial edict to arrest a criminal of the imperial court. We didn't mean to alarm." The person in the dark did not speak again. The constable felt the hard thing on his waist disappear and sighed in relief. When he raised his head again, there was only a vast stream of people. A person behind him asked, "Boss, what do we do now?" He pointed to another path with some annoyance and said, "Go around there, a criminal of the imperial court?" Lee frowned. The flow of people in the capital during the night was the highest of the year, and it was also the time when trouble was most likely to occur. Sung Shichen was muddle-headed. He actually chose this time to arrest a criminal of the imperial court. However, with Rui and Mississippi Lou, as well as so many guards in the dark, there was no need to worry about the safety of the arrogant girl and the others. He was only puzzled for a moment before he was pulled to the side by the arrogant girl to look at a unique goldfish lantern. On the other side of the street, Xiao Chui hugged Zheng Zumo's arm and begged, "Miss, you're the best at guessing lanterns. Please guess another one." Zheng Zumo looked at the different lanterns hanging on her arms and said grumpily, "You already have so many. Sister Ruoqing guessed 2 for you just now. Can you still carry them?" Xiao Chui looked down and then handed 2 lanterns to Xiao Zhu behind her. She turned around and said with a smile, "Now I can carry them." Zheng Zumo gently pulled her ear and said, "Let's talk about it when we go back. How can we stroll around with so many lanterns in our hands? Oh." The servant girl lowered her head in disappointment and said softly. Then she seemed to have thought of something. She raised her head and said excitedly, "Miss, do you think we can meet Lee tonight?" Zheng Zumo knocked on her head and said, "The capital is so big. How can you meet him just because you say so?" "Don't dream," the servant girl pouted. "But sometimes fate is so wonderful. Although the capital is big, as long as 2 people's hearts are the same. Oh, miss, if you hit Xiao Chui again, she will become stupid." Meowing Pavilion. On the night of the first month, this kind of entertainment place had the most business. The beautiful woman had been shuttling upstairs and downstairs, entertaining all kinds of guests. Seeing someone walk in from the door, she immediately went up and said with a smile, "Oh, young Master Chu, you are finally here. Shuang Shuang has been waiting for you tonight." She has already pushed away more than a dozen waves of people. Chu Ping was a loss and said in disbelief, "Ah, Shuang Shuang has been waiting for me up there?" "That's right." The beautiful woman smiled and said, "For the past few days, Shuang Shuang has been talking about how she is indebted to young master for saving her last time, but she is unable to repay you. She feels really guilty." Chu Ping was a little embarrassed and quickly waved his hand. "It was nothing. I believe that anyone with a bit of righteousness in their heart would not just stand by and watch. Seeing this, Chui Shixin shook his head slightly and pulled his sleeve. Come here. Chu Ping was pulled to a corner and asked in confusion, What? I said you were a bookworm, but you're not convinced. Chui Shixin looked at him and said helplessly, Can't you see that Lady Shuang Shuang has fallen for you? Chu Ping was shocked. Think about it. What is your identity? You are the eldest son of the Chu family, a man of striking appearance and great literary talent. What is her identity? She is just an entertainer. That day when she was bullied, who was the one who stood up for her? At that time, she was at her weakest and most helpless. It was you who gave her hope and light. For a woman to fall in love with you because of this, isn't that very normal? Chui Shixin looked at him and slowly said, Lady Shuang Shuang has never accepted a private invitation from anyone before. Why is it that she spends time alone with you every day? Do you think it's just because you saved her? You mean? Chu Ping looked at him in a daze and muttered, Lady Shuang Shuang, she likes me? Chui Shixin patted his shoulder and said, Hurry up and go up. Don't let Lady Shuang Shuang wait for too long. Brother, I can only help you this much. Chu Ping stood there in a daze for a long time before a happy expression gradually appeared on his face. He looked at Chui Shixin and said gratefully, Thank you for your advice, Chui Shixin. I will go up now. Seeing Chu Ping quickly walk up the stairs, Chui Shixin found a seat in the hall and sat down. He picked up a cup of green tea and gently swirled it. The corners of his mouth curled up as he softly murmured, That lady's body seems a bit weak. With Chu Ping's hobbies, I wonder if she can bear it. Somewhere on the street, a few bailiffs were sitting in front of a tea stall. One of them looked towards the wonderful sound pavilion. After a long time, he turned his head and asked, Boss, it's about time, right? The leading bailiff said in a low voice, Wait a little longer. It's not time yet. Chapter 868. The streets of the capital of Shangyuan were abnormally crowded. Although the surrounding guards had purposely created a relatively loose space in the middle, it was still very difficult to walk through. Yongning was too short and could only see the backs of others. Li Yi simply carried her up. The proud Lolita was already very tall. She had always felt that she was no longer a child like Yongning, but at this moment, she was a little envious of her. The streets were mostly filled with lanterns and acrobatics. However, after watching too many of them, it became boring. The performances in the brothels were much more exciting. The group of people walked about half the street and entered a brothel. The brothel was still crowded, but it was orderly. Li Yi and the two young ladies followed behind them. It didn't matter which venue they entered. These performances in the brothel were nothing strange to him. However, this spacious hall seemed a little different. Looking over on one side, there were young scholars gathered in groups of 3 to 5, whispering to each other. On the other side, there were curtains. There were light voices coming from inside, and he could vaguely see the women behind the curtains. In between these young men and women, there was a long line of lanterns that separated them. On the other side, there were some young people holding lanterns and writing something on them. The proud Lolita asked doubtfully, Sir, what are you doing? He also didn't know who thought of this new way of playing. He waved to a worker in the brothel and asked, What are you doing? The worker only felt that the young man in front of him looked familiar. After recalling, he shivered and hurriedly said, Greetings, young master. I'll call the manager over immediately. He waved his hand and said, There's no need. I'm just taking a look. What are they doing over there? The worker immediately replied, Those people on the left are all famous scholars in the capital. They write poems on the lanterns and hang them there. If the ladies behind the curtains take a fancy to them, they will send a servant to tie a sachet on the lanterns. Li Yi finally understood that this was simply another form of matchmaking. Back in the day, he had experienced it himself. He had received countless scented sachets and love letters. If he did not remember wrongly, it was from an open-minded lady who had even stuffed a warm didou into his arms. No wonder some of the scholars were in high spirits, while others looked unhappy. That was because some of the lanterns in the middle didn't have a single sachet on them. while others had a few hanging on them. Choosing a son-in-law wasn't rare in this era. If it was in the future, the lanterns would definitely not have poems but photos. Perhaps there would even be property certificates, car keys, and passbooks. Xiao Huan watched as a servant girl came out from behind the curtains and hung her lady sachets on the lanterns. She thought it was very interesting. She grabbed onto Li's arm and said excitedly, "Young master, why don't you also write a poem and hang it up? There will definitely be more sachets than all of them." In her heart, the young master was the most talented person. Otherwise, why would he be called the #1 scholar in the Jing Kingdom? If the young master put up a lantern there, it would definitely be the one with the most sachets. The arrogant Lolita wished for the world to be in chaos. She added fuel to the fire and said, "That's right. Mister, why don't you write a poem and beat them all? It's best if you don't even give them a sachet." The two of them seemed to want to see such a scene. Their expressions were somewhat excited. They completely didn't notice that the scholars not far away had expressions of displeasure on their faces. Hee, since when did such an arrogant person appear in the capital? He won't even leave us a sachet. Who does he think he is? The #1 scholar in the Jing Kingdom? Even the #1 scholar wouldn't dare to say such arrogant words. Some of the scholars not far away were feeling depressed. When they heard the words of the two young ladies, they felt ashamed and angry. However, they didn't want to argue with them. In a split second, the gazes on Li increased. Li knocked on the heads of the two of them and said, "Write whatever you want to write." Writing a poem also requires inspiration. It's not something that can be written just because you want to. There's nothing to see here. Let's go. Rui and Lin Wanru went to the venue next door. There weren't any performances there, but there was an exhibition of women's clothing. It was the most popular style of women's clothing in the capital this year. Li originally wanted to follow them, but the arrogant Lolita and Xiao Huan insisted on seeing who had the most sachets in the end. He could only accompany them there. What Xiao Huan wanted to see the most was the young master's poem. She rolled her eyes and walked over. She whispered, "Young master, you've written poems for Xiao Huan, for Miss, and for Miss Sung. You've written many poems for second Miss." Li looked at Mississippi Liu. Mississippi Liu also looked over. "Forget it." Li shook his head and said, "Other people's lanterns and sachets have other meanings. It's better if we don't disturb them." Mississippi Liu turned her head expressionlessly. In front of her, someone walked over. It was a scholar dressed in a scholarly robe. He looked rather refined. In his hand, he held a lantern that was obviously inscribed with words. He smiled and said, "Sorry to disturb you. I hope you don't take offense. It's just that when I saw you from afar, I was amazed and admired you. Suddenly, I was struck by inspiration and came up with a poem. This poem originated from you, so I wanted to give it to you." After this young scholar walked out from the crowd, a sigh came from behind the curtains. This young Master Zhou's literary talent was brilliant. He was very famous among the scholars in the capital. He was also a new imperial examination scholar. He was the best candidate for a son-in-law. There were already many people who had their eyes on him. But today, young Master Zhou actually gave the lantern with his poem inscribed on it to the young lady. This was the most direct expression of his feelings. What gift! Before Mississippi Liu could speak, Li walked straight in front of her. He said to young Master Zhou, "You're willing to give it to her, but others aren't willing to accept it." He looked at Mississippi Liu and asked, "Isn't that right, Rui?" Mississippi Liu glanced at him and asked, "Is that right?" Young Master Zhou saw this and was delighted. He looked at Li and twitched the corner of his mouth. He said, "You're not this young lady. How do you know if she's happy or not? Why, if you can't give this lantern out, you won't allow others to give it out." The lanterns here were not just lanterns. If one wanted to give a lantern out, he must write his own poem on it. The scene of Li Yi's refusal made this young Master Zhou feel that this person was just not talented and could not write a suitable poem. Of course, if he really tried to look impressive at his own cost and randomly wrote a poem, then what awaited him would be even greater humiliation. Li glanced at him indifferently. He had seen too many such clumsy provocations. He looked at Mississippi Lou and said, Xiao Huan is right. I haven't given you any poem. If I give it to you now, we don't need his. Xiao Huan had already taken her favorite lantern with a smile. The proud Lolita grabbed a pen from the other side of the table. If you want to give it or not, who cares? Mississippi Lou said in disdain. Her eyes looked at him. Li Yi held the lantern with one hand and wrote on the blank space with the other. He quickly put down the pen and held the lantern with both hands. He passed it to Mississippi Lou and said, Rui, this is for you. Young Master Zhou wanted to stretch his head out to look, but was pressed back by Li Yi. At this moment, a manager from the brothel walked over and asked carefully, Young Master, do you want to hang this lantern over? No need. Li Yi waved his hand. He looked at them and said, There's nothing interesting here. Let's go. Let's hang it. Mississippi Lou looked down and suddenly passed the lantern in her hand over. Although she was literate, she didn't know anything about poetry. However, she also wanted to see if the poem he gave her was good or not. Was it good to give to someone else? Chapter 869. Let's not hang it up. Lee looked at Mississippi Lou and said hesitantly. The manager had already explained the rules to him in detail. Once the lanterns were hung up, it meant that they had agreed to the rules. It was fine if there were no scented sachets, but if there was a lady who hung up her own scented sachet, the two of them would have to have dinner together. If there were more than one scented sachet, they would have to choose one. His house was already in a mess, and there were many unresolved issues. There was no point in flirting with other ladies. Mississippi Lou looked at him and shook her head. It's all right. I have nothing better to do, so I'll just take a look. Before young Master Zhou could see what was written on the lantern, the manager of the brothel had already hung it up. He waved his hand to summon another waiter and handed over the lantern in his hand, saying, Hang this up as well. Then he looked at Li Yi. It was obvious that he wanted to compete with Li Yi. Someone copied the poems on the two lanterns and sent them to the curtains. As for the candidates, according to the rules, their poems would not be revealed before the final result was revealed. What a mystery. I want to see how many scented sachets he can get. Even though I don't like Zhou, but he's just a nobody. He's overestimating himself. Every poem was recorded and sent into the curtains. Those who had yet to receive a scented sachet had already lost their chance. Those who had already received scented sachets, no matter how many of them there were, would not be embarrassed tonight. They were all waiting to watch the show. Of course, compared to this arrogant person who popped in halfway, they were still biased towards young Master Zhou from the bottom of their hearts. With the curtains blocking their view, they could only see the gist of it. However, they noticed that after the two poems were sent into the curtains, there was a commotion inside. Someone turned to look at young Master Zhou and clasped his hands, saying, Looks like Brother Zhou really got a good piece of work today. It was just luck. Young Master Zhou was confident in his poems, but he still replied humbly. His actions allowed the crowd to understand that the man surnamed Zhou was truly going to shine brightly today. Very quickly, someone walked out from behind the curtains. It was a maid with a bun on her head. That's from the Su family? Someone recognized him at a glance. Another person said with a smile, Miss Su has admired Brother Zhou for a long time. I'm afraid she's waiting for you to hang up her lamp today. That is because Miss Su thinks highly of me. Young Master Zhou smiled lightly and said, Miss Su is extremely talented. Actually, I also have some admiration for Miss Su. As soon as he finished speaking, a maidservant with her hair combed into a bun hung a fragrant sachet under a goldfish lantern. Sir, there's one. The Tsundra Lolita shouted excitedly. She had just bought this goldfish with her husband. Mississippi Lou looked at him and then looked away. Young Master Zhou's expression was a little awkward. He coughed twice and covered it up very well. He said, Hee hee, it seems that I have underestimated the people of the world. Someone comforted him, sighed Brother Zhou. Don't be discouraged. It's only one. Didn't Miss Su also fall in love with you? Look, isn't that girl from the Su family coming out? Miss Su is talented and beautiful. We also had a deep conversation. Young Master Zhou looked at the maidservant in emerald green clothes hanging the fragrant sachet under the goldfish and murmured, deep, deep conversation. Tutu. That Sundara Lolita and Xiao Huan hugged each other and shouted. What kind of poem did he write? Someone was stunned for a moment before revealing an extremely curious expression on his face. That Brother Zhou, perhaps? These 2 times were just accidents. Someone stared at the curtain and said, "Look, another person came out." She walked to the side. She didn't choose that goldfish. That's strange. Why isn't she holding the fragrant sachet in her hands? Everyone's eyes widened as they watched a maidservant walk out from the curtain empty-handed. She walked past that goldfish, walked past young Master Zhou's lantern, and came to the front of a lotus lantern. It's Brother Fong. Congratulations, Brother Fong. Although this lotus lantern had been displayed long ago, it was a little strange to hang the fragrant sachet only now. However, as long as it wasn't that weird goldfish, it was fine. Everyone cupped their hands towards a young man in the crowd. That young man smiled and cupped his hands in return. "Thank you for letting me win." After a round of congratulations, they saw that the maiden walked to the front of the lotus lantern and took down the fragrant sachet under the lantern. Then she took 2 steps back and hung the fragrant sachet under the goldfish again. This works too? How can this be? That young man with the surname Fong's expression froze. Looking at the lotus lantern that once again became empty, his expression gradually became sluggish. As for that young Master Zhou, he stood on the spot in a daze. The expression on his face was already indescribable. More and more people walked out from behind the curtain. Very quickly, the area below the goldfish was filled with fragrant sachets. Although not everyone hung the fragrant sachet under the goldfish, compared to the surrounding people, there was no need to compare. Those maidservants were afraid that they would fall behind. They huddled and shoved each other. The situation was starting to get out of control. It was to the extent that even the curtain had been lifted a little, and countless gazes were focused in a certain direction. At the same time, whispers could be heard from behind the curtain. "It's that young master. That young master is even more handsome than young Master Zhou. His poetry is also well written. Why haven't I seen it before? I wonder who he will choose today." He only glanced in a certain direction and felt as though he was standing naked outside. When Mississippi Lu looked over, he said innocently, "I already said that I'm not pretending this time, but you just wouldn't listen." As he spoke, he grabbed the excited Sundara Lolita and Yong Ning and quickly walked out. Seeing him leave as though he was escaping, Mississippi Lu looked at the crowd, not far away, and a smile appeared on her lips. It seemed like he really wasn't being perfunctory. More than 10 scholars surrounded an old man and urged, "Duke Song, what kind of poem did he write? Can you please evaluate it?" The area around the lantern was completely surrounded. The only piece of paper with the poem was in the hands of this old man. The old man, who was addressed as Duke Song, stroked his beard and looked at the piece of paper in his hands. After looking at it for a long time, he mumbled, "I can't evaluate it. I can't evaluate it. If I do, it would be superfluous." He looked outside the door and sighed. He is indeed the #1 scholar of the Jing Kingdom. He lives up to his reputation. What? The #1 scholar of the Jing Kingdom? He is Li Yi. While the crowd was stunned, young Master Zhou's face was already flushed red. Not far away, there were exclamations. "Where's the lantern? That lantern is gone. It was here just now. Look for it. Look for it quickly. Don't trample it." The brothel manager looked at the mess in the hall and revealed a bitter smile. How was he going to clean up this mess? Outside the door, Li Yi saw Mississippi Lu walking out with a lantern. He looked at her and asked, "How is it?" "It's all right." Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked, "I've been searching for her in the crowd for thousands of times. But when I look back, she's still there in the dim light. What does this mean? Who are you looking for?" "I'm not looking for anyone." He shook his head and pointed at the flickering lights in front of him. He said, "I wrote it blindly. Look, the lights are waning like a dream. The person you like walks out from the flickering lights, and the two of them stare at each other in a daze. What a beautiful scene." Mississippi Lu's gaze followed the direction of his finger. A few figures walked out from the dim light. Xiao Chui looked at the familiar figure in front of her. After a moment of shock, She waved her arms excitedly and shouted, "Lily, we're here." Chapter 870. Xiao Chui waved her hand and turned to look at Zheng Zumo. She said proudly, "Miss, I was right, wasn't I? Fate is something that no one can say for sure." Li also felt that this sort of thing like fate was really too wonderful for words. That person is really at the place where the lights are fading. Mississippi Lu stuffed the lantern into his arms and turned to enter the field that Rui and the others had just entered. Li turned his head to take a look. In the end, he still walked towards the figures in front of him. He looked at the more than 10 lanterns hanging on Xiao Chui and Xiao Zhu and said in surprise, "Why did you buy so many?" Xiao Chui shook her head and said proudly, "I didn't buy them. They were all won by Miss and Sister Ruoqing." Xiao Huan followed behind Li Yi and looked around. She suddenly didn't know what to do. Yongning ran in Zheng Zumo's direction excitedly. Apart from her brother and Sister Bingning, she liked Sister Zumo the most. Goddess Luo Shui looked at him and asked in confusion, "Is it just you guys?" As soon as she said that, Rui and Lin Wanru had already walked out from the field on the side. Although Mississippi Lu also walked out, she stood far away. Goddess Luo Shui ignored him and quickly walked over. She bowed to Rui and said in a low voice, "Greetings, sister. We are a family. There's no need to be so formal." Rui smiled and took her hand. "I saw a few clothes inside just now. They are very suitable for you. Let's go in and have a look." Zheng Zumo nodded and said, "I will listen to you." The two went in hand. Yongning also went in holding Zheng Zumo's hand. Xiao Huan and Xiao Chui followed closely behind. Ruoqing glanced at him, smiled, and went in as well. In an instant, on the street, there was only him and Lolita left. Lolita held his arm and said solemnly, "Don't worry, sir. I will never leave you behind." Li Yi rubbed her head. The arrogant Loli squinted her eyes, a satisfied look on her face. She suddenly opened her eyes and looked at Li Yi. She said seriously, "I will never abandon you. Can you promise me that you will never abandon Shanning?" Li Yi smiled and nodded. "All right, pinky promise." The Tsundere Loli stretched out her pinky. Pinky promise. Although it was just a child's words that could not be taken seriously, Li Yi's heart was full of gratification at this moment. He smiled and said, "They could go shopping by themselves. So we'll take you to eat delicious food. Only you." Okay. The proud Lolita widened her eyes, and her face was filled with joy. Although Mr. had never written a poem for her, he only brought her to eat delicious food. He did not bring Yongning, Sister Zumo, Sister Rui, Sister Xiao Huan, or Royal Sister. In short, she was the only man in the world now. Mississippi Lu leaned against the wall and watched the two figures disappear into the crowd. She looked at the lights everywhere with a slightly dazed expression. Lin Wanru did not follow Rui and the others in. She stood on the other side a few feet away and looked at the lanterns hanging outside. There were poems written on those lanterns. She walked from the first row and stopped in front of each lantern for a short while. Of course, some of them took a longer time, and some of them she just glanced at, until the last one. This time, she stayed for a full quarter of an hour. At a certain moment, she stood a little closer and murmured softly, searching for her thousands of times in the crowd. Suddenly looking back, that person is there in the dim light. This poem, what does it mean? Hearing the voice beside her, she turned her head and looked at Mississippi Lu. She smiled and said, "Although I don't know who wrote this poem and what kind of state of mind he had at that time, but from the literal meaning, it should be that the person who wrote this poem went through hardships just to find a person, but in the end, he realized that the person he was looking for was actually by his side all along." Mississippi Lu was stunned and asked, "Isn't it in the dim light?" Lin Wanru shook her head and said, "The dim light is just a reference. The main point of this poem is suddenly looking back." She looked at Mississippi Lu, who suddenly turned around and ran into the surging crowd. She stretched out her hand and said in surprise, "Miss Rui." Her figure disappeared in the blink of an eye. Lin Wanru only put down her hand after a long time. She shook her head in confusion and turned around to look at the lantern again. Li held the lantern in one hand and used the other to protect the proud Loli's swinging leg on his chest. This way, she wouldn't fall off from his shoulder. The proud Loli held a small bag in her hand. There were all kinds of snacks in it. While eating, she didn't forget to stuff some into Li's mouth from time to time. Surrounded by the crowd, there was a street performer performing the sword-swallowing technique. The proud Loli was watching happily, so Li didn't tell her the secret behind it. Suddenly, someone grabbed one of his arms. Li turned around and looked at Mississippi Lu in surprise. He asked, "Why are you here? Give me back my lantern." Mississippi Lu snatched the lantern from his hand. Then, she decisively turned around and disappeared into the street again. Li looked at the crowd on the street in surprise. She was the one who didn't want the lantern earlier, but now she was blaming him. However, when he thought about how it wasn't the first time she did this, he could only shake his head and sigh. Women's minds are not something you can guess. The proud Loli felt wronged and looked in the same direction as him. She said weakly, "That's my lantern. Miss Shuang's zither skills are getting better and better." In the deepest private room on the second floor of the wonderful sound pavilion, Chu Ping stood up from the praying mat in the middle of the room. He looked at the curtain in front of him and said with a smile, "That song just now has reached the realm of emotional harmony. It can stir up the emotions in the depths of one's heart. To be honest, I've only heard this kind of zither music from an old friend of Grandpa's. According to Grandpa, that person is already standing at the peak of the path of music. Miss Shuang is still so young. It's truly unbelievable." Behind the curtain, the young girl's hands were still on the zither. Perhaps it was because she had used up too much energy, but her face was pale and her forehead was covered in sweat. She didn't wipe away the sweat. Her eyes stared blankly in front of her and didn't reply. After a long time, she said, "Young Master Chu, come in." "I'll come in?" Chu Ping was slightly startled. Normally, even if he stayed in the same room with Miss Shuang, there would always be a curtain between them. This was the first time Miss Shuang invited him in. A thought suddenly flashed through his mind. Could it be that Cui Shixin was right? He tidied up his clothes and said, "Then, I'll come in." Chu Ping slowly walked over and gently lifted the curtain. The young girl was sitting with her back facing him. In front of her was a zither. Miss Shuang. He had just opened his mouth to speak when the young girl stood up. The clothes that were as thin as a cicada's wings slowly fell off her body, revealing her naked body. Chu Ping looked at her in a daze. "And Shuang." The young girl slowly turned around and faced him. She said softly, "Young master's great kindness, this little girl is unable to repay it. The only thing I can give young master is this pure body." Chu Ping clenched his fists and looked away with difficulty. He gritted his teeth and said, "If you only want to repay a debt of gratitude." The young girl's face suddenly revealed a flowery smile. She took a step forward and gently embraced Chu Ping. She murmured, in Shuang's heart, "She also likes young master," he said in a low voice. "When it comes to this kind of thing, I'm a little different from others." The young girl raised her head and looked at him. She said emotionally, Shuang is willing to do anything for young master." Chu Ping's body suddenly trembled. A look of joy appeared on his face, and his breathing gradually became rapid. Chapter 871. The Wonderful Sound Pavilion. Cui Shixin raised his head to look upstairs. He didn't know when, but one of the doors upstairs had opened a crack. He drank the tea that had already turned cold in one gulp and raised his head to look upstairs. He paced around the room a few times before impatiently walking to the door. Then he walked back inside, in front of a tea stall on the street. "Boss, I see it. Let's go." After a short exchange, a few bailiffs quickly stood up and pushed through the crowd. They loudly said, "We are here to arrest a criminal of the imperial court. Unauthorized personnel, get out of the way." The crowd moved aside, and a few of them arrived at the entrance of the wonderful sound pavilion. The leading bailiff waved his hand and said, "Go in and search." They were enjoying the music when suddenly a bailiff barged in. The guests in the pavilion were startled, and the musician stopped playing. When the beautiful woman saw the bailiff barge in, she hurriedly ran over and said in a panic, "Sir Bailiff, what's going on? We've always been doing proper business here." As she spoke, she stuffed an ingot of silver into the bailiff's hand. However, this tactic, which had always been successful, was useless at this moment. The constable raised his hand and pushed her away, coldly saying, "We are under orders to capture the imperial court's criminal. Someone told us that the criminal is being sheltered here. As for whether you are doing proper business here, we will know after a quick search." The beautiful woman was about to speak, but she was interrupted. "Stop talking nonsense." The leading bailiff glanced at her and said to the people behind him, "Search." The guests in the main hall were terrified and wanted to leave, but the main door was already blocked by the bailiffs. Naturally, they didn't dare to rush out and could only stand where they were, anxiously watching as the bailiffs went upstairs, kicked down the door, and searched. They just didn't know how many of the people inside would be so frightened that they would be permanently ill for the rest of their lives. Chui Shixin poured himself a cup of hot tea, raised his head to look upstairs, and continued to drink his tea. For the past few decades, the Chu family had been like a holy land in the hearts of the scholars of the Jing Kingdom. Grand Tutor Chu had students all over the world and had taught 2 emperors. In the current imperial court, including the left and right ministers, countless ministers had to respectfully address him as Old Man Chu. Grand Tutor Chu, who had always kept himself clean and was particularly strict with his descendants of the Chu family, probably did not want everyone in Jingdo to know that the eldest legitimate son of the Chu family was in a brothel and had some kind of perverted hobby when it came to making love with women. Fortunately, the bailiffs who were searching for the imperial court's criminal were from the capital governor's manor, so the Chui family was able to exert some influence. Otherwise, this scandal, which was enough to affect the reputation of the Chu family, would have spread far and wide. Chui Shixin raised his head to take another look, then slowly stood up and walked upstairs. On the main street, passers-by saw the officials blocking the entrance of the wonderful sound pavilion. They stopped in their tracks and watched from afar. In the restaurant on the opposite side, a large man poured warm wine into a cup and handed it to a middle-aged man opposite him. "Fifth master, the wine is warmed." The middle-aged man raised his wine cup. The burly man was about to sit down opposite him when he saw that the burly man's hand was trembling nonstop. The wine in the cup spilled all over his sleeves, but he didn't seem to care at all. He raised his hand and brought the wine cup to his lips. At this moment, there was not a single drop of wine left in the cup. "Fifth master, what's wrong? Are you very cold?" The large man hurried over and saw that the window behind the middle-aged man was open. He immediately said, "I'll go close the window." He stood in front of the window and glanced down. Strange, what are those people looking at down there? "Don't close it." At this moment, the middle-aged man's gloomy voice seemed to come from his throat. "But if you don't close it, the wind outside will blow in." I said, "Don't close it." Okay, if you don't close it, then don't close it." The large man helplessly shook his head. He waved at the waiter beside him and said, "Bring a heater over. Hurry, hurry." The middle-aged man raised the empty cup and drank a mouthful. When he put down the cup, his arm couldn't help but tremble. The cup knocked against the table and made a clear sound. This attracted the attention of the people at the neighboring table. The large man walked over and looked at him. He asked in fear, Fifth master, are you sick?" "I'm fine." The middle-aged man didn't raise his hand. He said in a deep voice, "Pour the wine." "But, pour the wine." The large man could only obey. He watched as the cup of wine was brought to his mouth. There was not a single drop left, but he still pretended to drink heartily. He shook his head and filled the empty cup again. "I've been ordered to search for the imperial court's criminal. Don't touch the people inside." One of the constables kicked open the door and saw 2 naked worms on the bed in the room. He shouted loudly. The man and woman on the bed had long been scared silly. 2 bailiffs had already rushed in and roughly swept their eyes over them. Their gazes fiercely landed on the woman's body a few times, then looked at the man. They waved their hands with some disdain and said, "It's all right, you guys can continue." After walking out of the room, They looked at each other and walked straight to the innermost room. "I've been ordered to search for the imperial court's criminal. Don't touch the people inside." The leading bailiff kicked the door open. The other two bailiffs immediately rushed in and rushed to the bed behind the curtain. Behind the curtain, the man's heavy breathing suddenly stopped and turned into panic. Who are you people?" The leading bailiff looked at the man on the bed and was stunned for a moment. He immediately cupped his fists and said, my apologies. I didn't know young Master Chu was here and disturbed you. Please forgive us. We will leave immediately. He looked at the bed. Chu Ping's hand was still on the woman's neck. The woman's exposed body was also covered in green whip marks and candle tears. The constable sucked in a breath of cold air and looked at Chu Ping. He cupped his fists again and said this. Young Master Chu's preferences are really unique. Young Master Chu, don't worry. We didn't hear or see anything tonight. Please continue. He waved at the two people in the room and said, what are you waiting for? Hurry up and leave. When they reached the door, a figure came in from outside. Cui Shixin looked at them and his face darkened. He said angrily, who let you in? The bailiff smiled apologetically. Before he could say what he had rehearsed beforehand, he suddenly heard a terrified voice from the bedside. Chu Ping fell from the bed. His face was pale and bloodless. He murmured, this can't be real. This can't be real. Shuang, wake up. I didn't use any force just now. I really didn't use any force just now. The bailiff looked at this scene in astonishment. Before he could ask, one of the bailiffs looked at the naked woman lying on the bed. He slowly extended his hand and put it in front of her nose. He then turned his head and said in disbelief, dead? What? Cui Yinxin and the bailiff's expressions changed at the same time. In the restaurant, the burly man looked at the middle-aged man whose clothes were mostly wet. He shook the empty wine flask and said, Fifth Lord, there's no more wine. Let's go back. The middle-aged man picked up the remaining wine in his cup and slowly spilled it on the floor. He supported himself on the table and stood up with some difficulty. He said in a hoarse voice, let's go back. That person is the Qin clan's fifth lord. Based on the way that man addressed him, it should be him. I heard that when this Qin clan's fifth lord was young, he was a famous person in the capital. However, because the Qin clan had Qin Yin, he usually kept a low profile. How did he become like this now? You don't know. AI, this matter is also a sin. Downstairs, the burly man walked out of the restaurant with a middle-aged man on his back. He looked at the crowd and asked, Fifth Lord, do you want to stay and watch the show? A light cough came from behind him, followed by a hoarse voice. Let's go back. You really don't want to watch? The burly man asked doubtfully. Let's go back. All right, let's go back. The burly man shook his head and sighed. He carried the middle-aged man on his back and disappeared into the crowd. Chapter 872. How is this possible? Cui Shixin's face was pale, and his expression was one of fear. Is she really dead? How did she die? The bailiff once again placed his hand under the woman's nose and carefully examined her neck. With great difficulty, he said, She was strangled to death by young Master Chu. Chu Ping sluggishly sat on the ground and continued to mutter to himself, It wasn't me. I told you that if she couldn't take it anymore, she could just pat the bed, and I would stop. Chu Ping, quickly, put on your clothes and come with us. Cui Shixin finally came back to his senses. He looked at Chu Ping and said anxiously. He then instructed the constable, Go and open the window at the back. You two stand guard here. Don't let anyone in. Their original plan was to use the matter of Chu Ping visiting a prostitute to make the Chu family owe them a small favor. Who would have thought that a life would be lost? This favor was too great. Not only could the Chu family not bear it, they couldn't pay it back either. He looked at Chu Ping, who was still in a daze, and solemnly said, Remember, the person who killed Lady Shuang was the criminal of the imperial court who jumped out of the window. When that villain wanted to hurt you, it was fortunate that the bailiffs from the capital governor's office arrived in time. Seeing that Chu Ping was still sitting there and muttering to himself, Chui Shixin fiercely slapped his face and angrily said, "Did you hear me clearly?" Chu Ping's mouth was overflowing with blood as he raised his head to look at him. His eyes gradually regained their clarity, and he nodded. I heard it clearly." Chui Shixin walked out and closed the door. He said to the two bailiffs at the door, "Watch this place. No one is allowed to enter or leave." The beautiful woman walked over and worriedly asked, "Young Master Chui inside, shut up." Chui Shixin coldly looked at her and said, "Have everyone go downstairs. I suspect that there is a criminal of the imperial court among them. If they are found, your wonderful sound pavilion will not be able to escape responsibility." The beautiful woman's face paled. Criminal of the imperial court? In the Chui clan, Chui Qingming sat in the main hall, leisurely drinking tea. When he saw Chui Shixin rushing in from outside, he stood up and frowned. "What's wrong? Did you not succeed? Didn't you already use 1,000 silver taels to bribe that girl?" Chui Shixin swallowed a mouthful of saliva and said with a trembling voice, "It's done. Since it's done, why are you panicking?" But that woman was killed by Chu Ping." "What?" Chui Qingming suddenly stood up. The teacup fell to the ground with a clang and shattered. He looked at Chui Shixin and asked in disbelief, That woman is dead? Father, don't worry. For the time being, no more people know about this. I've already sent people to control that place." Chui Shixin looked at him and said anxiously, "Father, what should we do now?" If they were only acting in secret, a few lives were nothing to them. However, the problem was that today's matter was specially arranged by them. Those bailiffs had caused such a huge commotion, it was impossible for them to easily cover it up. What about the capital governor's residence? Chui Shixin immediately said, "I haven't sent anyone to inform them yet. Send someone to tell Lord Song to slow down his actions." "What about you, father? Get someone to prepare a carriage. I want to go to the Chu family immediately." In the Chu family, a middle-aged man looked at Chui Qingming and said, "Brother Chui, why have you come to the Chu family so late at night? Father is already asleep. If there's anything, we can talk about it tomorrow." Chui Qingming took a deep breath and said, "Brother Chu, time is of the essence. I don't have time to explain to you now. If there's any delay, nephew Chu Ping will probably be in big trouble." Upon hearing his son's name, the middle-aged man immediately asked, "What big trouble?" Chui Qingming said in a low voice, "It concerns nephew Chu Ping's life, and even more so, the Chu family's reputation." The middle-aged man's expression changed drastically. He immediately said, "Brother Chui, please sit here for a moment. I'll immediately invite father over." Chui Qingming didn't sit for long before he saw Grand Tutor Chu draped in a thick cloak and supported by someone. He hurriedly got up and said respectfully, "Greetings, Lord Grand Tutor." The old man waved his hand and asked, "Just what happened? Speak." Chui Qingming hesitated for a moment, then said, "Tonight, Shi Xian and nephew Chu Ping went to the Fine Sound Pavilion to listen to music. A woman in the pavilion revealed her feelings to Chu Ping. It's hard for young people to be a little impatient. Coincidentally, the constables of the capital governor's residence were searching for a criminal of the imperial court, and they accidentally ran into the two of them having sex." The middle-aged man's expression relaxed slightly. If it was just this, it wouldn't be too serious. It was just a normal affair between a man and a woman, and it didn't count as visiting prostitutes. Even if it did, although it would damage the Chu family's reputation, it wouldn't be so serious that it would endanger their lives. The old man looked at him with a sharp gaze. "You came here so late at night for this?" Chui Qingming lowered his head and said in a low voice, "When the constables of the capital governor's residence went in, that woman was dead." A terrified expression appeared on the middle-aged man's face. The old man's body trembled, and he couldn't even hold his crutch steadily. His beard trembled, and he struggled to stand. He repeatedly said, This animal. Chui Qingming looked up and asked, "Shi Xian has already ordered people to temporarily suppress this matter. Now, the people of the capital governor's residence will most likely go over. Qingming came here in the middle of the night to ask Lord Grand Tutor how this matter should be handled, The old man trembled as he walked to a chair and sat down. After a long silence, he waved his hand dispiritedly and said, "This old man is not the capital governor's residence. There is no need to ask me about this matter." A trace of anxiety appeared on the face of the middle-aged man beside him. He was about to speak when Shui Qingming suddenly said, "The criminal of the imperial court that the capital governor's residence captured was truly deranged. He hid in a fine sound pavilion and not only used cruel methods to kill that young lady, but he also wanted to harm nephew Chu Ping. Fortunately, the constables arrived in time." The old man didn't reply. He used the chair to support himself as he stood up with difficulty. His murky gaze rested on Shui Qingming for a long time before he waved his hand and said, "This old man is tired. Qingming is truly sorry to disturb Grand Tutor. Grand Tutor, please do not worry. This matter will definitely not involve nephew Chu Ping." Shui Qingming said this and bowed. "Grand Tutor, rest early. Qingming will return first." The old man used his crutch to walk out the door. He shook off the middle-aged man's support and said in a hoarse voice, "When you return, have him kneel in the ancestral hall." The middle-aged man's expression was complicated as he slowly nodded. "Fifth Master, I'm leaving." The large man looked at the middle-aged man who had already taken off his clothes and went to bed. After saying this, he slowly retreated. A woman wearing coarse clothing walked over with a warm stove in her hand. She said, "The master is afraid of the cold, so I brought an extra stove in." The large man opened the door and said, "I'll help you put it in." The woman smiled and shook her head. "No need. Your hands and feet are clumsy and your footsteps are heavy. The master has just fallen asleep and will be woken up by others. It's better if I go, you go rest." The large man rubbed his head in embarrassment. Then I'll go to sleep first." The woman nodded. After the large man left, she walked into the room and placed the stove on the ground beside the bed. She straightened her body and looked at the middle-aged man on the bed in the darkness. She sighed and said, "You don't need to be sad. Shuang Er's body doesn't have many days left. Lian used to love her the most. To be able to do something for you before she goes to see Lian, she must be very happy." In the darkness, the middle-aged man lying on the bed suddenly opened his eyes. He clenched his fists and tore the bedsheets. A suppressed, beast-like roar came from his throat. "There's a way. There must be another way. She doesn't need to do this. She doesn't need to do this." In the wonderful sound pavilion, a bailiff once again turned his head to look at the bed. A puzzled expression appeared on his face. He pushed the person next to him and whispered, "Look, isn't she smiling?" The bailiff turned his head to look and saw that the woman was already dead. Sure enough, there was a faint smile on her face. He walked over and covered her body with the bedsheet. He let out a long sigh. "She's also a pitiful person." Early in the morning, the large man pushed open the door and walked out. The cold wind blew against his face and made him shiver. He looked at the courtyard full of white in a daze and muttered, "Didn't it get warmer a few days ago? Why is it snowing again?" He returned to his room and wrapped himself with another layer of clothing. Then he walked out through the garden path and walked toward the courtyard. He stopped halfway. In the depths of the garden, a plum blossom tree had quietly bloomed. It immediately added a few more decorations to the vast expanse of white in the garden. In front of the plum blossom tree, a figure stood straight in the snowflakes that filled the sky. "Fifth Lord, you came out so early today. Why didn't you open an umbrella?" The large man walked over and carefully brushed away the snowflakes on the middle-aged man's shoulders and body. He saw that a thick layer of snow had also fallen on the middle-aged man's head. It was unknown how long he had been standing there. He gently swept away the snowflakes on the middle-aged man's hair. However, there were a few places where the snowflakes couldn't be swept away no matter what. The middle-aged man's movements became sluggish. He looked at the middle-aged man in a daze, and a shocked expression appeared on his face. Fifth Lord," the middle-aged man turned his head to look at him. He revealed a smile and said, "This person, if you don't pay attention, you will grow old." Chapter 873. Li Yu was woken up by the cold in the morning. Since a few days before the Lantern Festival, the weather had gradually turned warm. Even the quilt on his bed had been changed to a thin one. However, he couldn't stand the cold in the middle of the night. He curled up his body and didn't sleep well. He slept in a daze until dawn. Of course, the reason why he woke up was because the proud Lolita ran in and put her cold little hand into the quilt. He didn't know what she had just done, but her little hand was like an ice cube. After a shiver, he was no longer sleepy. "Sir, get up. The sun is shining on your butt." The proud Lolita was wearing a thick cotton-padded coat. She rolled around the bed like a bear. Lee, he wanted to sleep a little longer in the quilt, so he had to get up. He put on his coat and asked casually, "Why are you here so early today? Don't you need to pay your respects to your father?" The proud Lolita lay on the bed and shook her legs. She said with a sad face, "Father is sick. The imperial doctor said that father needs to rest well these days. I came over after seeing him outside." These days, the old emperor's illness had become more and more serious. He was a little worried. He only hoped that the winter would pass quickly and that the worst situation would not happen now. Hearing the noise and laughter coming from outside, he wondered, "What's going on outside?" The proud Lolita curled her lips and said, "They're having a snowball fight. Sister Xiao Huan is already 17 years old, but she is still so childish. I have long stopped playing that kind of game." Li was stunned and asked, "It's snowing?" The proud Lolita nodded and said, "It started last night. It's very, very heavy. Sir, hurry up and get up. Let's go outside and make a snowman. Make the biggest one and make it bigger than theirs." The sudden heavy snow fell silently. Compared to previous years, there was not much snow this winter. However, it still snowed after the Upper Lantern Festival. This was something that had never happened in recent years. Of course, the night of the Upper Lantern Festival did not only have heavy snow, but also poetry. Searching for her thousands of times in the crowd. But when I look back, that person is standing in the dim light. This poem only took half a night to spread among the circle of scholars in the capital. The #1 scholar of the Jing Kingdom, whose poems had not been circulated for a long time, was so extravagant. This once again cemented his position in the hearts of those who loved poetry. This was not the only incident that caused a stir in the capital last night. There was a vicious court criminal who, while hiding from the bailiffs, hid in a music hall in the capital. After being discovered, in his anger and humiliation, he killed a musician in the music hall and escaped through the window. Now, his wanted poster had been posted all over the streets and alleys of the capital, as well as all the city gates. Furthermore, because that scoundrel had almost injured the young master of the Chu family, the capital governor's manor had already strictly ordered the yamen in the capital region to investigate the whereabouts of that criminal and offered a large reward. This made it so that if the people of Jingdo saw an unidentified outsider outside, they would all secretly pay more attention. The capital yamen. After an old man washed his hands in a copper basin, he respectfully said, "Sir, we have already investigated. This woman died because she suffocated. The 2 strangulation marks on her neck are the cause of her death." Sung Shichen's face darkened. "Has the identity of this woman been investigated?" A bailiff came forward and said, "Sir, we have already asked the people in the wonderful sound pavilion. That woman was a musician in the pavilion and had a bit of fame. She did not go to the wonderful sound pavilion every day. As for the situation of her family, we are still not clear. We have already sent more people to investigate." The old man hesitated for a moment and then opened his mouth. "Sir, according to my examination, this woman was actually already infected with a serious illness and did not have much time left. Even if this did not happen, I'm afraid she would not live for more than half a year." Sang Shichen sighed and said, "Even if she was already beyond cure and did not have much time left, half a year is still 180 days, 2,160 hours. This is still a case of murder." Someone finally stood up behind Sang Shichen. Chui Qingming looked at the few people in the hall and said, "You may leave first." When the coroner and the bailiffs heard this, they immediately bowed and retreated. Chui Qingming looked at Sang Shichen and said slowly, "This matter involves the Chu family. The royal tutor has already tacitly agreed to it, so there is no need to complicate matters. Furthermore, that woman does not have much time left. Sir Tsang should know what to do, right? Of course I know the severity of the matter. Tsang Shichen waved his hand. I will order people to quickly search for that criminal. Don't worry. Chui Qingming smiled. Then I can rest assured. Tsang Shichen looked at him and asked, Are you sure that this matter alone will make the Chu family wholeheartedly help us? Don't worry. The royal tutor is a smart man. If this matter is exposed, the Chu family's reputation will suffer a severe blow. The royal tutor may not care about himself or Chu Ping, but he will definitely not ignore the reputation that the Chu family has painstakingly built up bit by bit. Chui Qingming smiled again. If that's the case, that woman's death is not completely useless. His Highness, the King of Shu, is still more important. Tsang Shichen nodded and clenched his fists tightly in his sleeves. He looked at him calmly and said, Since that's the case, leave the matters here to me. I believe in Sir Tsang. Chui Qingming cupped his hands at him and said, I have to personally give a reply to the Chu family. I will take my leave first. Take care. After sending off Chui Qingming, Chen Qiong, who had been drinking tea to the side, stood up and said, If this is all we have, we won't be able to touch the Chu family. Tsang Shichen shook his head. It's not that we can't touch them, but that the time is not right. The time is not right? Chen Qiong was taken aback. Then he looked at him and narrowed his eyes. Do you know what you will do when the time comes? You must give up something to gain. Tsang Shichen looked at him and slowly said, If you want to obtain something, you must first give up something. Be **starred. You be **starred. My Chu family has been of noble character and unquestionable integrity for generations. How do we produce a be **starred like you? Chu Ping knelt on the ground. In front of him were the memorial tablets of the Chu family's ancestors. Grand Tutor Chu raised the cane in his hand and struck it repeatedly on his back. The clothes on his back were already in tatters, and his back was a bloody mess. Grand Tutor Chu's breathing was ragged. A middle-aged man hurriedly patted him on the back and said, Father, Father, don't be agitated. Grand Tutor Chu shook off his hand and looked at him. He said angrily, You taught your son well. His son had always been traveling with his father, and he had never taught him anything. Although the middle-aged man felt wronged, he did not dare to say anything. Chu Ping knelt there and wailed, It's all my fault. I've disgraced the Chu family's ancestors. Grandfather, just beat me to death. Beat you to death? What's the use of beating you to death? Will that woman come back to life if I beat you to death? Although the old man said this, the cane that he had raised did not come down again. He panted slightly and glanced at Chu Ping. A trace of loneliness appeared on his face. As he turned to leave, he said, Let the ancestors of the Chu family watch. Let him kneel here for 3 days. Chu Ping lay on the ground, his body trembling. He loudly said, Thank you, grandfather. Thank you, grandfather. Chapter 874. Qin Family. After the family banquet, Qin Xiang looked at his eldest son and said, The reform mentioned this morning is related to agriculture. If you are not careful, it will shake the foundation of the country. You must be very careful with every step you take. You must not be careless. Qin Yin immediately nodded. Father, don't worry. I will be extra careful. However, since it is a reform, you don't need to be too conservative. Don't be too careful, Qin Yin respectfully said. I understand. After the conversation, Qin Xiang stood up and walked out of the room. Halfway through, he realized that he had left a dossier he had read before the meal on the chair. He turned back, and when he stepped through the door again, he was slightly startled. There was only one person left in the hall. That person was a bit thin. He stood up from the corner of the banquet table and placed the leftovers in front of him. Before he sat down, he saw Qin Xiang standing at the door. Father. He looked at Qin Xiang and was surprised. Seeing him looking at him, he looked down and smiled. There's still a lot of food left. If I don't eat, it will be a waste. Qin Xiang looked at his youngest son and was startled. There were strands of white hair on his head. When he smiled, There were wrinkles on his face. He was the youngest of the 5 Qin brothers, but he looked much older than his eldest brother. The old man realized that he had not paid attention to his son for a long time. Those dishes are already cold. If you're not full, just ask the kitchen to make another serving. Qin Xiang brought the file over. When he walked out, he paused and said, "Don't eat too much at night. Rest early and be careful of your body." Qin, he nodded. "Father." Qin Xiang heard the voice and turned around. Qin, he looked at him and said with a smile, "The court is in turmoil. Although father is in a high position, you still have to be careful." Qin Xiang frowned and said, "Recently, the court has been unprecedentedly stable. How can there be turmoil? Don't believe the rumors outside." Qin, he listened respectfully. After he finished, he nodded and said, "Thank you, father, for the reminder. I understand." Qin Xiang took another deep look at him, then turned around and left. Fifth young Master Qin looked at the leftover soup in front of him. The clear soup reflected his image. He stroked a strand of white hair on his head and stared at the soup in a daze. On the night of the Lantern Festival, it snowed all night. Although the snowfall gradually subsided, it still did not clear up. It was still early in the morning. On the streets of the capital, other than a few shops that had their doors half closed, most of the shops that faced the streets were tightly shut. A woman with her hair wrapped up and wearing only a thin shirt stood in front of a small building and knocked for a long time. When a beautiful woman inside opened the door, she rubbed her face that was red from the cold and smiled. "My sister is a musician in this building. She came to perform on the day of the Lantern Festival and hasn't been back for 2 days. Can I trouble you to call her? She's not in good health and has to take medicine every day." The beautiful woman rubbed her sleepy eyes and yawned. She asked in a muffled voice, "What's your sister's name?" The woman smiled and said, "Her name is Shuang Shuang." "Sir, what are they doing?" The proud Lolita lifted the curtain of the carriage window and saw a group of people gathered at the foot of the city wall. She turned her head and asked Li, "They're probably looking at the court's criminal." As the carriage drove over, Li also heard the discussion of some people on the street. It seemed that yesterday, a criminal wanted by the court committed a murder case in the capital. Using the chaos of the Upper Yuan dynasty, he successfully escaped. This made the higher-ups very angry. They did not hesitate to issue a large warrant for his arrest. The bounty was even more generous. They paid a great price to capture this person and bring him to justice. The capital was under the feet of the emperor, and the criminal was a criminal wanted by the court. Coincidentally, it was the Lantern Festival. It was no wonder that the higher-ups had such a big reaction. However, with the warrant being issued, unless the criminal had the ability to change his appearance, it would not be easy for him to escape near the capital. It must be known that around Jingdo, there was a group of madmen who wanted to farm points to raise their ranking. How could they let go of such a good opportunity? In principle, for a criminal wanted by the court with great fanfare to appear in Jingdo and commit another crime was an inconceivable thing. However, there was always an oversight. At this moment, the matter of the criminal was not important to him. The old emperor's health was more important. This snow had come suddenly, and the old emperor's illness had also worsened suddenly. From the beginning, Li Yi knew that there was no possibility of his illness recovering. Sometimes it was all about luck. Even though he had already let go of court affairs and focused on recuperating, no one knew when bad luck would arrive. Li Yi's mood was a bit depressed. Some things could be solved perfectly, and some things could not. Faced with this matter, even he felt a deep sense of helplessness from the bottom of his heart. The carriage suddenly came to a stop. The proud Lolita lost her balance and fell on top of him. A red cloud appeared on her face. In a small voice, she said, "Sir, I didn't do it on purpose." Li Yi supported her waist and helped her sit properly. The angry scolding of a palace guard could already be heard from outside. "How do you walk? Don't you have eyes?" After scolding, the guard knocked on the carriage in a panic and asked, "Your Highness, are you all right?" "I'm fine," the proud Lolita replied in a small voice. She then asked, "What happened outside?" The guard immediately said, "A woman suddenly walked out of the alley and almost ran into her. I had no choice but to rein in the horse and disturb your highness. Please forgive me, your highness. The proud Lolita asked in a quiet voice. She didn't hurt anyone, did she? A guard had already helped the woman who had fallen to the ground up. He furrowed his brows and asked, "Are you all right?" The woman didn't look at him. Her eyes were unfocused as she walked forward in a daze. Strange person. The guard glanced at her and turned his head. Your highness, she didn't hurt anyone. Let's keep going. He lifted the curtain to take a look, only to see a distant silhouette. He shook his head and lowered the curtain again. After visiting the old emperor, the dark clouds in Li Yi's heart dissipated a little when he walked out of the hall. Naturally, it was because his illness wasn't as serious as he had expected. It was probably because of the sudden drop in temperature that he was having a relapse. A eunuch led him to the side hall and said that the heir and the eldest princess were already waiting there. When Li Yi and the proud Lolita walked in, they found that they weren't the only ones in the side hall. Princess Ning was holding Mingzhu's hand and talking. Li Xian was playing chess with Ning Wang. Seeing them enter, Princess Ning waved at the proud Lolita. "Shaning, come quickly, come here." Li Yi bowed slightly and said, "Greetings to Ning Wang and Princess Ning." Every year, at the beginning of the year, the nobles from all over would enter the capital. Because Li Xian was in the capital, Ning Wang's family would often stay for a few more days. "Dr. Li, no need to be so courteous." Ning Wang waved his hand and looked at him. He shook his head and said, "In terms of the ability to judge people, I really am not as good as my royal brother. Dr. Li is an outstanding person. I actually misjudged you back then." Chapter 875. You flatter me, your highness. Li Yi cupped his hands in greeting politely. He did not appear overly intimate, nor did he appear overly distant. His friendship with Li Xian was limited to the two of them. He once had some connection with Ning Wang Fu, but that was a long time ago. You've been in the capital for so long, and you even have a child, but your chess skills haven't improved at all. Ning Wang picked up a black piece and put it down. He looked at Li Xian and shook his head. Li Xian smiled awkwardly and said, "Father's chess skills are superb. I am ashamed." Ning Wang looked up at Li Yi and suddenly said, "I wonder if Dr. Li is interested in playing a game with I?" To tell you the truth. Li Yi looked at Ning Wang and shook his head. "I'm not proficient in Go." He was speaking the truth. He had never played Go in his previous life. Although the rules and playing methods could be easily learned, he couldn't learn the experience. Otherwise, he wouldn't have to play with the proud lowly and release the Dumbo, the earth-drilling mouse, and the celestial dog. With his current level of Go, he could only fool ordinary people. He was far from a master of Go. Li Xian had already given up his seat. He said, "You are the #1 talent of the Jing Kingdom. Don't be humble. It would be best if you could win a few games against Father and help me save some face." Li Xian stood up. Ning Wang was sitting across from him and looking at him. It would be too awkward to refuse again. Li Yi could only nod and sit across from Ning Wang. "Sir, you are playing Go with Uncle." The proud lowly ran over from the side and sat next to Li Yi. She propped up her chin with her hands and poked her head out to watch the game. Princess Ning and Mingzhu also walked over. Ning Wang looked up at Li Mingzhu and said, "These days, thanks to you, brother can recuperate in peace. If it were anyone else, he wouldn't be able to relax in the affairs of the court." Princess Ning held her hand and said worriedly, "Look, it has only been a year. You are so thin now." Li Yi didn't quite understand Princess Ning's words. She drank soup every day, and he even added some special ingredients to the soup. How was she skinny? Martial artists like her had well-proportioned bodies and didn't have any excess fat on their bodies. From head to toe, there were parts of her body that were fatter than a year ago. It was impossible for her to be skinny. It is indeed inappropriate to let you decide the affairs of the country alone. Prince Ning put down a piece and said, "The efficiency in the 3 provinces is low, and there are many useless people. Outside the 3 provinces, you should make an exception and find some talented and virtuous people to help you deal with those trivial matters. You." After he looked at E and said, Dr. Li is really not good at Go. Before Li Yi could speak, the proud Loli wrinkled her nose and said, Uncle, I will play for you. Ning Wang smiled and said, Since when does our Shawnee know how to play Go? I will not play with you. If your father knows, he will say that I am bullying the young. The proud Loli put a piece on the board and said discontentedly, Uncle, don't look down on me. I'm very good at Go. Good. Shawnee is the best. Seeing that Li Yi didn't mind, Prince Ning didn't say much. He played with her hand, but his moves were not as sharp as before and became casual. Princess Ning continued the conversation and looked at Imingzu. She said, Your uncle is right. You still need to find someone to help you in the affairs of the country. The capital governor is good. The people from the Shun family are said to be very capable. Prime Minister Qin is old now, but there are still a few people from the Qin family in the court. Like father, like son. In short, it is not so easy to take over the government affairs. Don't tire yourself out. Dong Wenyun is indeed very capable. Although the one from the Shun family is not as good as him, he is also not bad. As for the Qin family, except for Prime Minister Qin, there is no one capable. Prince Ning shook his head. He seemed to think of something and said, Qin He of the Qin family. What is his position in the court now? Qin He? A glimmer of confusion appeared in Mingzhu's eyes. In the second generation of the Qin family, other than Qin Yin, there were two other people who were officials in the court. She had never heard of this Qin He. Li Yi, who was watching the proud Loli play Go, said, Qin He, the fifth son of Prime Minister Qin. He has always been idle at home and has no official position. That is a bit strange. Prince Ning shook his head and stopped thinking about these things. He continued to talk about the matters of the court with the eldest princess. Li Yi had always thought that this Prince Ning, who was far away from the capital, was just an idle prince. However, when he talked about these matters, it was as if he had been in the court for a long time. It was truly surprising. Qin He, the fifth master of the Qin family. He had just said that the Qin family had no one capable, but he had singled out Qin He. What was so special about this fifth master of the Qin family? From Wu Er's side, there would often be news of the Qin family. More or less, the name of the fifth master of the Qin family would appear. However, the general description was the same as the rumors in the outside world. This fifth master of the Qin family did not have much of a position in the Qin family. He could even bully the younger generation of the Qin family as he pleased. As a result, he had always been in a state of self-abandonment. However, sometimes he would do some strange things. The proud Loli saw that his mood was not too high and thought that he was upset because he couldn't beat Imperial Uncle Ningguang. She patted her little chest and said, Sir, don't worry. We are about to win. Prince Ning, who was talking to Mingzhu, turned his head and couldn't resist smiling. Although little Shawnee knew how to play Go, which was somewhat unexpected, her skill level was not high. He only needed to casually deal with it. This Dr. Li was a friend of Mingzhu and Xian. Naturally, he couldn't let him lose too badly. However, this game of Go had reached this point, so there was no need to continue. He smiled and picked up a chess piece. Just as he was about to put it on a certain position, his arm sank halfway. After a slight pause, he could no longer smile. The proud Loli raised Li Yi's palm and reached out her little hand to give a pat. She said with a smile, Sir, we won. The princesses of the royal family were not easy to deal with. Don't compete with them, Mingzhu. Don't play Go with Shawnee. This was an iron rule. Prince Ning lost a game of Go. He was surprised by the proud Loli's Go skills and proposed another game. Of course, the proud Loli would not refuse. After all, Prince Ning had been immersed in Go for many years. No matter how talented the proud Loli was, she was only 14 years old. After a fierce fight, she gradually fell into a disadvantage. Of course, the one who lost in the end was still Prince Ning. Turning defeat into victory and reversing the situation was the proud Loli's specialty, especially after she used the flying chess, the invisible chess, and the ultimate move of eating up the small chess pieces. Prince Ning lost without any suspense. The old emperor's illness was not as serious as he had imagined, which made him feel a little relieved. On his way home, sitting in the carriage, he inadvertently glanced out through the gap of the curtain, only to find that Fong seemed to have a lot on his mind. Before he could ask, Fong opened the curtain a little and asked, "Young master, I have a question to ask you." He sat up straight. The first thing he thought about was whether he had encountered anything recently so that he wouldn't be hurt by his words. After finding that he probably hadn't, he looked at him and said, "What's the matter? Say it." Fong looked at him and hesitated for a long time before he said, "I want to take little Hong home. What do you think will happen?" "I think you will die." He looked at him and said without any hesitation. He was well aware of his sister-in-law's temperament. She had bought a large mansion in the capital city, and all the servants in the house were men. Not to mention young and beautiful maidservants. There wasn't even an old lady with yellow pearls. Forget about bringing Xiao Hong back. If she knew what Lao Fong had been secretly doing for the past 2 years, Lao Fong wouldn't be sitting in the carriage and asking him this question now. With his timid personality, how could he suddenly have such a suicidal idea? Li thought for a moment, looked at him, and asked suspiciously, "You didn't take the girl's body, and now you can't take it anymore, right? How could that be?" Fong waved his hands repeatedly. "Young master, even you don't dare to do this kind of thing. How could I really? Really?" Fong raised a hand. "I swear if I say half a word of lie, let me be struck by lightning." No sincerity. Li shook his head and said, "It's winter. How could there be lightning?" Boom! As soon as he finished speaking, a thunderous sound suddenly exploded in his ears. Fong's whole body trembled. He looked up at the sky and found that there was no more sound. He looked at Li and asked, "I really didn't do it. Could it be that young master?" Boom, boom, boom. The deafening sound came again, and it hurt people's eardrums. Chapter 876. The rumbling sound came suddenly. Fong turned over and rolled off the carriage. He looked at the sky vigilantly. After listening for a while, he realized that the sound did not come from the sky. He turned his head and saw that not far ahead, there was a woman beating the big drum in front of the yamen. What he heard just now was not thunder, but the drum. He breathed a sigh of relief and jumped back into the carriage. He said, "So someone is beating the court drum. I was scared to death." The court drum was a large drum erected in front of the yamen. It had 2 functions. One was for the county magistrate to beat the drum to gather the crowd when he went to court. The other was for the commoners who had been wronged to beat the drum to express their grievances. He lifted the curtain and took a look. The woman who had beaten the drum had already been ushered in by the yamen runners. He did not pay much attention to her. He put down the curtain and looked at old Fong. "Are you serious about what you said just now? It's not a good way to go on like this." Fong sighed and said, "There has to be an end to this matter." He hung the curtains to the side and asked curiously, "How did you and Lil Red meet?" Fong leaned against the carriage and looked at the sky. He smiled and said, "About a year before you came up the mountain." At first, Li thought that Fong was just a simple and honest man without many thoughts. Later, he found that his thoughts, especially when it came to feelings, were extremely delicate. Under his simple and honest appearance, there was a soul of coquettishness. He and Little Red got to know each other because of the old story of a bear saving the beauty. Later, they met in the jadeite courtyard by chance. As time went by, they became familiar with each other. They communicated with each other across the wall in the jadeite courtyard and gradually developed to the point where they were today. According to Fong, it was not to the point. At present, the two of them only held hands in a pure relationship. The relationship between him and Mrs. Fong should be familial, and Little Red was probably Fong's love. As for how to make the two perfectly fuse, if he knew, he wouldn't have to run between them every day. His own affairs were still a mess, and he couldn't help much with Fong's family affairs. He could only shake his head and say, "Let's think about this at length." "That's right. Let's take our time to think about it." Fong nodded and said, "Miss Suamo has already succeeded. Second Miss Ruoqing, Princess Royal, Miss Lin, and even Xiao Huan hasn't married yet. I'm afraid that the little princess only has Xiao Huan in her heart." We need to think about them one by one. Lee thought for a moment and said, well, I'll ask Rui to go over and talk to Mrs. Fong. Tell her that you want to bring another mistress back. As the first wife of the Fong family, she should be generous and not obstruct you. She will definitely listen to Rui. How about it? That's good enough, right? Fong waved his hand repeatedly. Forget it. I can solve this kind of trivial matter myself. I don't want to trouble Miss. The carriage gradually went away. In the yamen, a constable sent the woman out, shook his head, and said helplessly, Miss, this case has been handled by the yamen from the beginning to the end. You can go there and ask. The woman's face was pale, but she still nodded and said, Thank you, constable. The constable looked at her and said with pity, Miss, let me remind you, when you go to the yamen, don't knock the drum in front of the gate. Chu Ping, Chui Shixin, Li Yi crumpled the paper in his hand into a ball and threw it into the stove. Chui Shixin and the young master of the Chu family were also in the wonderful Sound Pavilion when the imperial court criminal committed the murder. It was said that they were almost implicated. This was also one of the reasons why the capital governor's office placed so much importance on this case. He had never underestimated the Chu family and had always sent people to keep an eye on them. However, this matter had been handled by the yamen from the beginning to the end. Sung Shichen hadn't sent any news, so there shouldn't be any problems. He warmed his hands by the fire, then picked up his brush and began to write on the rice paper spread out on the table. Mississippi Lou insisted that the green jade case lantern festival he had written on the lantern that day was too sloppy. There were many words in it that she didn't recognize, so it wasn't a suitable gift. She wanted him to write again. It was normal that Mississippi Lou couldn't recognize it. She only knew a few words, and the situation that day was different. In order to speed things up, he had used a type of calligraphy that was between cursive and semi-cursive. Anyone with a bit of knowledge in calligraphy would be able to recognize it, but to an illiterate like her, it was naturally scribbled and couldn't be seen clearly. However, she was Mississippi Lou. If Second Miss wanted her to write it in regular script, she would write it in regular script. It wasn't a big deal. After Li Yi finished writing, she checked it and nodded in satisfaction. Li Yi reminded her, Don't forget, you still owe me something. What is it? Asked Mississippi Lou with a frown. According to the rules of the Lantern Festival, the lantern and the sachet had to be exchanged in the end. Mississippi Lou took his lantern, so she naturally had to give him a sachet. This was the rule of the game. Since you took my lantern, you have to give me something. It's something that you women wear closely. Reminded Li Yi again. Mississippi Lou frowned even more. What are you talking about? Li Yi pointed at her chest. You still haven't guessed it. That year in the Mid-Autumn Festival, in that garden, those women stuffed it into my arms. Mississippi Lou finally understood. The doo-doo that was stuffed into his arms was thrown away by her. She looked up at him and asked coldly, Are you sure? Li looked at her expression and said in surprise, It can't be. It's not something valuable. You can't even bear to give it to me. Why don't you return the lantern to me? I don't want that thing anymore. Come in, I'll give it to you. Mississippi Lou thought for a moment. She crossed her arms and walked into her room. She said, Remember to close the door. It was just a sachet. Why did she have to be so mysterious and close the door? It was not like she was doing something shameful. Li Yi shook his head and followed her in at the entrance of the capital magistrate's office. How many times have I told you? No one has claimed the body. It has long been buried in a mass grave. As for where it was buried, how would I know in the dark? A bailiff impatiently waved his hand and said, The magistrate's office is already doing its best to capture the culprit. The wanted poster has already been sent out. As long as the culprit is still in the capital, he won't be able to escape even if he has wings. Don't worry. Once we have news of the culprit, we will immediately send someone to inform you. The woman said softly, Even in the hot summer, an unclaimed body should be kept for at least 3 days. Moreover, it is winter now, so it should be at least 7 days later. It's the new year. The coroner has already examined the body. There is nothing suspicious about the case. We just need to wait for the culprit to be brought to justice. The yamen has nowhere to keep it for you. I've already told you what you need to know. I'm warning you, don't cause trouble here again. If you do, we won't be polite anymore." When the bailiff spoke again, his tone had become angry. The woman knelt in front of the yamen and said in a sorrowful voice, "I just want to know how my sister died." On the street, passers-by gradually gathered around and looked at the woman with puzzled gazes. They looked at the yamen's door and pointed at it. When did she have another sister? In the back hall of the yamen, Chui Qingming slammed his hand on the table and said angrily. Sung Shichen took a sip of tea and said unhurriedly, "Although this is unexpected and there are a few more variables, it may not be a bad thing. If even her family believes that the woman died at the hands of the culprit, then there will be no more changes to the case in the future. I'm just afraid that the changes will happen now." Chui Qingming narrowed his eyes and murmured. Hearing the murderous intent in Chui Qingming's words, Sing Shichen raised his head and glanced at him. He stood and said, "This woman must not be touched." Chui Qingming smiled and said, "Brother Tsung, there is no need to remind me. I know that if anything happens to this woman, it will attract the attention of people with ulterior motives." Sing Shichen nodded and said no more. The two of them discussed a few more things before Chui Qingming left the yamen through the back door. When he stepped onto the carriage, his body paused slightly, and he turned his head to look at a guard in front of the carriage. He stretched out his hand and lightly waved it in the air. Inside the yamen, at the dining table, a woman heard the rumbling outside and put down her bowl and chopsticks. She said with dissatisfaction, "What is going on outside? There is no end to it, is there?" A yamen runner came in from outside and said with a bitter face, "My lord, that woman did not listen to our advice at all. She has begun to beat the drum and complain about her grievances again." Sang Shichen put down his chopsticks and his face darkened. He said, "The capital yamen is not a place for her to behave atrociously. Guards, arrest that woman. Give her 20 strokes of the cane and temporarily put her in prison." The yamen runner was stunned and said with some uncertainty, "My lord, this punishment, isn't it a bit too heavy?" Sing Shichen waved his hand. "No matter. The prestige of a yamen is not to be provoked. Only a heavy punishment will serve as a warning. Just be careful when executing the punishment." The yamen runner said no more and bowed. This subordinate obeys. Chapter 877. At the entrance of the capital magistrate's office, the woman beating the drum was once again stopped by a bailiff. Many passers-by had stopped to watch from the side of the street. They pointed at the woman not far away and whispered to each other, "I saw her beating the drum here early in the morning. I wonder what kind of injustice she has suffered. I heard that it's because of her sister's death. I also heard the bailiff say that she's a criminal. I'm afraid it's not because of the case at the wonderful Sound Pavilion 2 days ago. That evil thief's wanted poster is posted all over the street. What's she doing here? Could it be that there's more to this case?" As the crowd discussed animatedly, a bailiff walked out from inside and looked at the woman. He waved his hand and said, "Take her down. This is the capital magistrate's office. Is this a place for you to mess around?" The bailiff looked at her indifferently and turned his head to say, "Sir has ordered that this woman has repeatedly challenged the magistrate's authority and obstructed official business. Take her in and give her 20 strokes." Then he walked forward and dispersed the crowd on the street. He loudly said, "There's nothing to see here. Disperse, disperse." Although the drum at the entrance of the yamen was used by the people to seek justice, it was not allowed to be beaten randomly and disrupt the yamen's normal order. However, even though there was such a rule, the woman had just lost a loved one. It was understandable that she was grieving. To punish her like this was somewhat unreasonable in the eyes of the crowd, however. This was not something they could discuss. They could only shake their heads and disperse as they watched the woman being taken in. "Boss, are we really going to give her 20 strokes?" A bailiff looked at the thin woman and said hesitantly, "What if she dies after 20 strokes? You pig brain." The bailiff fiercely knocked on the man's head and said angrily, "Sir is said to pay attention to propriety. If she dies, you'll pay with your life. The bailiff, who was knocked on the head, put on a long face and asked, "What propriety?" The bailiff waved his hand. "It's enough. After beating her, take her to jail and lock her up first. Don't let her come out and cause trouble again." A moment later, the constable came to the pale-faced woman who was pressed on the stool. The scene of the woman's death that night appeared in his mind, and a trace of pity appeared on his face. He shook his head slightly and waved his hand. "Give me the board. I'll do it myself." When the two bailiffs escorted the woman into the prison, they felt that today was an eye-opener. After working in the yamen for so long, this was the first time they saw someone who could walk to the prison on her own after being flogged. "I don't want it anymore. I don't want the sachet anymore. I don't want the lantern anymore. I don't want the poem anymore." He covered his butt and limped out of Mississippi Lou's room. He turned around and said, "Take it if you like it. What else do you like? Just take it. It's all yours." Mississippi Lou glanced at him and said faintly, "Who told you not to make it clear?" He didn't want to explain anymore. Wasn't it clear enough just now? She owed him. The thing that a woman wore close to her chest, and someone had given it to him before. Other than the sachet, what else was there? A belly band? She didn't even think about it. He was a dignified county marquis, a man of indomitable spirit. How could he be so perverted? Mississippi Lou looked at him again and said, "I owe you the sachet. I'll return it to you in the future." "Forget it. Not in the future. I don't want it anymore." Lee rubbed his, but that was still faintly aching. When did she develop this bad habit? Couldn't she find another place to start? "You have to take it even if you don't want it." After saying this, Mississippi Lou flipped her hair and left him a cool view of her back. Although she said it directly, it was already 2 months later that he received the sachet from Mississippi Lou. If it was a simple sachet, he could just buy one on the street. However, Mississippi Lou was so picky about his gift. She even asked him to make a new copy of the poem. Of course, she wouldn't be so careless with her gift. The cloth used for the sachet was carefully selected from her collection of cloth. She heard from Xiao Huan that Second Miss took a full 3 days to choose the spices and then to embroider something on it. Sewing the broken pieces of cloth together in this period of time, she did not know how much was wasted. That was why it dragged until now. She was very good at fighting with others, but when it came to cooking or needlework, it would greatly lower the level of most women. Li held the sachet sewn by Mississippi Lou. He was very sure that if he wore it out, he would definitely be laughed at by others. However, looking at the eyes of Mississippi Lou, he could only ignore his conscience and nodded. "Very good. I like it very much." Mississippi Lou's somewhat nervous expression finally eased. She said, "It's my first time sewing. There are many places that are not done well. Just make do with it." Li nodded and said, "There are indeed many places that are not done well. For example, there are some marks in the stitching of the cloth. The color matching is not very good. The stitches are thin and dense. The choice of spices seems to be—" Mississippi Lou looked at him calmly. "Also what?" Li hung the sachet on his waist with satisfaction and said, "It seems there is nothing to be picky about." No matter how ugly the sachet sewn by Mississippi Lou was, it was still unique in this world. He either insisted on this truth, or beat her and tell her what was wrong with the choice of spices and the matching. Today, Li did not have the time to fight with her for 300 rounds to correct her mistakes, because today was the day that Lin Wanru and Lin Yong set off to return to the Qi Kingdom. The caravan of merchants from the Qi Kingdom who came along with them had left the capital city long after the Lantern Festival. They had stayed for more than 2 months. If they did not return soon, the Lin family's business in the Qi Kingdom would most likely have an unforeseen event. He had discussed all the details of the cooperation with her a month ago. This time, he would also send a caravan of merchants and guards to escort them to the Qi Kingdom. The caravan arrived at the city gate. Rui and Lin Wanru were talking. Rui came down from the carriage and patted her hand, saying, "It's a long journey from here to the Qi Kingdom. Sister Lin, be careful on the way." Lin Wanru smiled and said, "Although it's a long journey, we've gone back and forth several times. With these guards escorting us all the way, You don't have to worry, sister. Then she walked to Li Yi's side, looked at him, smiled, and stretched out her hand, saying, "Goodbye." Li Yi was stunned. Then he also stretched out his hand, and the two of them shook hands. Lin Wanru turned her head, looked at Rui, and explained, "This is a kind of etiquette in our hometown called the handshake ceremony. It's used to greet friends who have not seen each other for a long time, or to bid farewell to friends who are about to be separated." Lin Yong looked at this scene in astonishment. After scratching his head, he also stretched out his hand to Li Yi and said with a sad face, "Li brothers, goodbye." Li Yi punched him hard on the shoulder and said with a smile, "Why are you pulling a long face? It's not like you won't see each other. In less than half a year, I'm afraid you'll have to come back to the capital again." Lin Yong smiled honestly and said embarrassedly, "It's not that I can't bear to part with you, Li brothers." Li Yi smiled and said, "Two men, don't be so sentimental. I can't bear to part with the food cooked by Li brothers." After Lin Yong finished speaking, Li Yi was stunned. Then he waved his hand and said, "Let's go, let's go." He watched Lin Yong get into the carriage with a big smile, leaning against the carriage and waving at him. When Lin Wanru bent down to lift the curtain, she looked back and disappeared behind the thick curtain in the next moment. The convoy slowly drove out, and when the last carriage could not be seen, Li Yi turned his head and said, "Let's go back." "Mother," the city gate was crowded with people and it was noisy, but he and Ru Yi both had extraordinary hearing. How could they not hear this childish and somewhat muffled voice? Rui looked down at the little fellow in the swaddling clothes, and a happy expression appeared on her face. She suddenly looked at Li Yi and asked, "Husband, did you hear that just now?" Although the 6-month-old child could not understand language yet, under the deliberate guidance of his mother, he was already able to spit out words one by one. Li Yi sighed and said, "As expected, my wife still won." Li Duan also seemed to feel Rui's joy. He curled up in his swaddling clothes and smiled. He opened his mouth again and made a vague sound. "Little mother." Chapter 878. Li gently poked the little fellow's soft face and said, "If you want to call me mother, there's no little mother." The two words he said were not clear. They were vague and could barely be distinguished. A 6-month-old child, even if he was gifted or had been guided early, could only say a few more words. It was unlikely that he would understand the meaning. Li guessed that apart from Rui, Xiaohuan was the one who spent the most time with him. She had heard so much that when she forced herself to say it, she would naturally be confused. However, in this way, who was the winner or Rui? In detail, Xiaonyang was also a mother, so Rui was a little better. When he returned home, the proud Lolita had already come over. She bounced out of the yard and asked, "Sir, where did you and Sister Rui go?" The little fellow stretched out her hand from Rui's arms and said vaguely, "Little mother." Li Yi remembered that when he made the bet with Rui, the proud Lolita was the referee, so she was the one to announce the final result. The proud and pampered Lolita's eyes spun as she said, "But little Duan, I didn't call out father or mother. Sir and big sister Rui didn't win." Li Yi pinched her face and asked, "Neither of us won. So who won?" "If neither of us won, then of course the referee won." The proud Lolita said seriously, "So sir, you have to promise me one thing." "What is it?" As soon as Li Yi said it, he felt that something was wrong. How could there be a referee in a match? However, the proud Lolita didn't give him a chance to change his words. She said with a smile, "I haven't thought about it yet. I'll tell you when I've thought about it." She seemed to be afraid that Li Yi would go back on his words, so she ran away quickly after saying that. Ru Yi looked at him, smiled, and said, "Since my husband didn't lose, then the agreement between me and my husband." Li Yi waved his hand and said righteously, "Lil mother is also a mother, so it's still my wife who wins." Walking on the street with the incognito eldest princess and looking at the orderly Jingdo, Li Yi turned his head and asked, "How has the emperor been these 2 days?" Emingzu shook her head and said, "It's better than before, but I'm still resting in bed most of the time." Li Yi didn't know how to continue this topic. The old emperor's health was deteriorating year by year. Even Li Yi himself wasn't confident. A few carriages slowly approached from the front. Li Yi, and she moved back a little. Looking at the carriages slowly moving away, Li Yi murmured, "These carriages look a little familiar." And Mingzu turned her head to look and said calmly, "An envoy from the Qi Kingdom." Li Yi asked in surprise, "Why did the Qi Kingdom send an envoy here again?" From what he remembered, ever since the third prince of the Qi Kingdom had caused a ruckus in the Jingdo, the envoy from the Qi Kingdom had returned. Later on, the friction between the two countries intensified. Even now, there were still occasional disputes on the border. What was the purpose of the Qi Kingdom sending an envoy here again at this time? To negotiate for peace. Mingzu looked at the bustling crowd in front of them and said, "The emperor of the Qi Kingdom is seriously ill. I'm afraid he doesn't have much time left. The eldest prince and the third prince of the Qi Kingdom are locked in a fierce struggle for the throne. The court is also divided into two factions that are evenly matched. This time, the envoy from the Qi Kingdom has come to the capital on behalf of the eldest prince to negotiate for peace with us. The eldest prince is the crown prince of the Qi Kingdom. Even if the Qi Kingdom doesn't value the eldest son as much as other countries, the eldest prince has, after all, entered the East Palace. He's the heir apparent in name. There's no lack of support in the court. Why would he need our help?" At this delicate moment, the eldest prince had sent an envoy to negotiate for peace. Naturally, it wasn't just to negotiate for peace. It was likely that he wanted to borrow some power from the Jing Kingdom to deal with the third prince. For the crown prince to end up like this, it was truly tragic. And Mingzu glanced at him and said, "Originally, it was indeed like this. Although the third prince of the Qi Kingdom has a reputation for being virtuous, he's still the third prince. He doesn't have a legitimate title. However, not long ago, the crown prince of the Qi Kingdom turned the entire Qi Kingdom into a mess. The people's grievances rose everywhere, and the hearts of the people were shaken. Many in the court were disappointed in him and turned to support the third prince. That's why the two of them are evenly matched now. It seems there's such a thing." Li nodded and said, "What did the court officials say?" Mingzu shook her head and said, "They only revealed their intention to negotiate for peace. They haven't formally proposed it yet. My imperial father's health isn't good. He hasn't summoned them these few days. I'm afraid they'll have to wait until my imperial father's next court session." Li Yi didn't have much of an opinion on the matter of negotiating for peace. However, from this matter, he could feel the changes in the Jing Kingdom over the past 1 or 2 years. He could still remember when he first came to the capital. The carriage driven by the envoy of the Qi Kingdom still dared to run amok on the busy streets of the capital. In just 2 short years, the envoy no longer had that kind of arrogance and despotism. He was even more restrained than some of the nobles in the capital. However, when he left the Qi Kingdom, he didn't hear anything about the emperor of the Qi Kingdom. Could it be that the saying Ing Hua guards his heart was really true? It was just that the person Ing Hua was guarding was not the old emperor, but the one in the Qi Kingdom. He wasn't so free that he would even worry about the affairs of the Qi Kingdom, so he didn't ask more. This time, the princess went out incognito to see the suffering of the people. At the same time, she also went home to get a meal and spar with Mississippi Liu. In the last few spars, Mississippi Liu had always been slightly better. She was usually busy with political affairs, so it was impossible for her to practice martial arts every day like Mississippi Liu. Occasionally, she would spar with him. Perhaps she had even learned something from it and progressed quickly. Of course, in this way, the eldest princess had lost both in person and in spirit. Although compared to before, the gap between the two had shrunk a lot. After drinking too much soup, the effect was naturally not as obvious. In front of Mississippi Liu, it would be difficult for her to raise her chest in this lifetime. And Mingzu casually pointed to the front and said, "In front is the government office of the capital. Let's go in and take a look." Li Yi nodded. He hadn't seen County Magistrate Liu for a long time. He didn't know if the hurdle in his heart had been crossed or not. You too. What grievances do you have? Don't be anxious. Speak one by one. Sitting in hall, Jingdo Magistrate Lu Dayo gently tapped the gavel and pointed to the two people below. An old man below replied, Sir, my daughter went to the river to wash clothes yesterday morning and has not returned yet. Hearing this, Lu Dayo furrowed his brows and looked at the other person. He asked, What about you? Why did you report the case? The man's expression was sorrowful as he said, My lord, this commoner's wife returned to her parents' home 3 days ago and hasn't returned since. This morning, this commoner went to her in-laws' home to inquire, but they said that they had never seen her. My lord, you must uphold justice for this commoner. 2 more have gone missing. Lu Dayo's brows furrowed even more. In 1 month, there had been over 10 women who had mysteriously disappeared. He was about to open his mouth to ask more details when his eyes flickered and his body suddenly shook. He quickly walked out and bowed. Greetings, Your Highness. Surly, Prime Minister Qin walked out of the door and said to an elegant young man, After you go back, help me bring a message to the Grand Tutor. Tell him that in 2 days I will come to visit him. I will certainly bring the message. Chu Ping bowed and said, I will remember Prime Minister Qin's teachings. I will take my leave today. Prime Minister Qin nodded and said, Qin Yu, go see Chu Ping off. Qin Yu walked forward and extended his hand. Brother Chu, please. Chu Ping looked at him and smiled. Thank you, Brother Qin Yu. Chu Ping walked first, and Qin Yu followed behind him. His footsteps were very slow because the young man in front of him seemed to have trouble moving his feet. His steps were deep and shallow, and his pace was also very slow. Prime Minister Qin watched the two of them leave and slightly shook his head. The two of them were the same age, but one of them spent all day visiting the great scholars and learned scholars in the capital, seeking knowledge and dispelling doubts. The other person was a playboy that everyone in the capital hated. In the garden, the large man glanced outside and asked, Who is that person? These past few months, he has been coming to our house every few days, the successor of Grand Tutor Chu. He is thirsty for knowledge, and is indeed different from those playboys. The middle-aged man's gaze looked in the direction that the young man disappeared in and slowly said. The large man nodded and said, He looks all right, but his legs are not very nimble. The middle-aged man's gaze was still looking in that direction. After a long time, he withdrew his gaze and looked at the large man. You've been by my side for 2 years. The large man scratched his head and said, I forgot, but it seems so. 2 years is not a short time. The middle-aged man sighed and stood up. He looked at the large man and said, There is an important matter that I need you to do. The large man revealed a puzzled expression. What is it? The middle-aged man waved his hand, and the large man moved his ear closer. Fifth Master, don't worry. Leave this matter to me. There will be no problem. After a moment, the large man's face revealed an excited expression. After patting his chest, he quickly left. The middle-aged man watched him leave. After a long time, he sat down again and took a sip of tea. He muttered, It has already been 2 years. Chapter 879. In the Yamen, Mingzu frowned and asked, Within a month, there have been more than a dozen cases of women and girls going missing near the capital? Lu Dayo nodded and said, Since the first case a month ago, including the 2 today, there have been 13 cases. The security in the capital had always been good, and there were countless heroes of the martial arts world among the people. There were very few major cases. After the first few cases of women going missing, he didn't pay too much attention. But now, there were a total of 13 cases. As a small magistrate of the capital, he would soon be unable to handle it. Although the court had repeatedly banned the trafficking of women and children, there were still people who dared to do it under the feet of the Emperor of Jingdo. Li Mingzhu looked at the 2 people in the hall, whose faces were full of sorrow, and turned her head to ask, Have you found any clues? Lu Dayo shook his head and said, I have sent people to investigate many places and even had the constables stand guard at night. But the thief is very careful and doesn't commit the crime in the same place. Until now, there have been no clues. What did Lu Yizhi say? Li thought for a moment and looked at him and asked, "Has the case been submitted to the Ministry of Justice?" Lu Dayo shook his head again. Assistant Minister Lu is busy with work and has a few major cases on hand. I think that if it is not necessary, it is better not to give him trouble. Li nodded and waved his hand. Go and bring the files of these cases over. Hearing this, Lu Dayo was delighted. He had already seen official Li's ability when he was in Qing, in prefecture. Seeing that the advisor next to him was still in a daze, he kicked him and hurriedly said, "Hurry and bring those files over." Then he looked at Li Yi and Zhang, eldest princess, and said, "Your Highness, official Li, please go to the back hall." In the back hall of the yamen, Imingzu saw Li Yi flipping through the files without saying a word. She couldn't help but ask, "Did you find anything?" "Don't worry. Do you think I'm the reincarnation of Lord Bao?" Li Yi flipped through the files and turned his head. "Lord Lu, please bring me a map of the vicinity of the capital." County Magistrate Lu was more reliable and didn't have as many questions as Princess Royal. Without saying anything, he quickly asked someone to take out a detailed map. February 13th, Yang Village. Li Yi looked back at County Magistrate Lu and asked, "Where is Yang Village?" County Magistrate Lu casually pointed to a place above, and Li Yi drew a circle at that location. Li Yi flipped open another scroll. 16th of February, Wei Village. "Where is Wei Village?" County Magistrate Lu pointed. "Here." At this moment, he had already understood Li Yi's meaning. Even if he didn't know what Li Yi was going to do, he still took the initiative to mark the locations of the missing women on those files. Seeing Li Yi begin to connect those marked small circles with lines, a big net immediately appeared on the map. After that, County Magistrate Lu circled the place with the densest lines on the net. If he still didn't understand what Li Yi was doing, he wouldn't have been able to sit in the position of the magistrate of the capital for so long. With admiration on his face, he immediately bowed and said, "Thank you for your advice. Official Li." Li Yi put down the pen, waved his hand, pointed at the big circle drawn at the end, and said, "Send people to visit this place secretly. Be careful not to be discovered and alert the enemy. If you find something, don't act rashly. These people have committed crimes repeatedly without being discovered, so they can't be ordinary people. At that time, the Secret Intelligence Office will cooperate with you. Since he had encountered this matter, he could only do it conveniently." That was all he could do. Walking out of the county government, the eldest princess shook her head and said, "There are people who are so bold in the territory of the emperor. If we are far away from the capital, I don't know how chaotic it will be. Where there are people, there are evil. The great harmony of the world is just an ideal. It's already amazing to make the world seem peaceful on the surface." Li Yi turned his head to look at her and said, "Miss, work hard." There was no obvious change in the expression on Mingzhu's face. When he sent her to the gate of the palace, he suddenly said, "Don't forget what day is the day after tomorrow." "What day is the day after tomorrow?" Li Yi's heart skipped a beat. He, who had been traumatized by this, couldn't help but tremble when he heard similar words again. Last time, Mississippi Lu told him not to forget what day. It was 7 days later. He racked his brains, but couldn't remember it. It was not Rui's birthday, not her birthday, not Xiao Huan's birthday, and not even the 3rd anniversary of their meeting. He had been on tenterhooks for a whole day. He used a roundabout strategy to ask Xiao Huan and found out that his birthday was 7 days later. He had been very depressed about this. How could there be such a strange question in the world? He asked tentatively, "Is it 2 years, 7 months, and how many days?" Seeing that the expression on her face became confused, he immediately changed his words. "No, that's your birthday? No, your birthday just passed." Seeing her frown, a light flashed in Li Yi's mind. He suddenly said, "I remember. The day after tomorrow. The day after tomorrow is the first day of your menstruation. Remember to drink more water and rest more. Don't get tired." put aside the affairs of the court for now and let the people below do it." Mingzu looked at him and said calmly, "The day after tomorrow is the first day of the first day." Li thought for a while and said with certainty, "Last month was also the first day of the first day." Mingzu said lightly, "On the first day of the first day, you have to go to the morning court. Father specially said that there is only one morning court every month. You won't die if you get up 2 hours earlier." Li, he just remembered that in the past few months, if the old emperor was not so sick that he couldn't get out of bed, he would still go to the morning court in person on the first day of the month. "Oh, I see. I have to go to the morning court on the first day of the month." Li nodded. When he turned to walk back, he turned back and said, "However, you still have to remember to rest more." In a room of the Qin family, the big man said apologetically, "Fifth Lord, I'm sorry. I can't do that." The middle-aged man looked up at her and asked why. The big man sighed and said helplessly, "That girl was taken away by the yamen. I don't dare to stop the people from the yamen." The middle-aged man stood up and asked slowly, "Which yamen?" "The capital magistrate's office." The big man said angrily, "The people from the capital magistrate's office are too despicable. That girl's sister died some time ago, and she went to the yamen to complain. She was arrested and locked up for 2 months. She was only released for 4 hours, and then she was taken back again. They said that she stole something from the magistrate. Isn't this nonsense?" "Fifth Lord, I'm sorry, I couldn't protect her. She stole something from the magistrate and was arrested again." The middle-aged man murmured and sat down slowly. After a long time, he waved his hand and said, "It's okay, it's not your fault." The big man asked curiously, "Fifth Lord, who is the girl you asked me to protect?" The middle-aged man sighed and said, "She is a pitiful person." The big man nodded repeatedly. "She's quite pitiful. Why don't those officials have any sympathy?" The middle-aged man waved his hand casually. "You can leave first." The big man responded, retreated to the door, and closed it. The middle-aged man lowered his head. After a long time, a smile appeared on his face, and he murmured, "Tsing Shichen, Tsung Shichen." Chapter 880. The morning court of the Jin Kingdom had long been reduced to a mere formality. There were 3 provinces and 6 ministries to maintain the operation of the imperial court. In fact, there was no need for an emperor. Some important decisions could not be decided by the subordinates, and the eldest princess would be the judge. If even the eldest princess could not make a decision, she would have to ask the old emperor for his opinion. On the first day of every month, the ceremonial morning court would be held. If there was nothing very important, the old emperor would only show up for a short while. Her Highness the Princess, who assisted the government, sat on the lower left side of the old emperor to distinguish her status. But now, the position where Li Yi stood in the court could no longer be leaned against the pillar. His position was only behind the 2 prime ministers and was equal to the ministers of the 6 ministries. Listening to the reports of the officials in the court, Lin Mingya felt a little sleepy. Suddenly, he heard the sharp and thin voice of a eunuch. "Summon the envoy of the Qi Kingdom for an audience." These days, the envoy of the Qi Kingdom had been very well behaved in the capital city. He was so well behaved that he did not seem to be the envoy of the Qi Kingdom. But according to the rumors they revealed, this time they came to seek peace. It was normal for them to be well behaved. The envoy of the Qi Kingdom stepped into the main hall. After standing still, he bowed and said in a loud voice, "Greetings, Your Majesty." The envoy of the Qi Kingdom had a proper attitude and a humble expression, which made the officials of the Jin Kingdom feel refreshed. Because of the great power of the Qi Kingdom, even when the envoy was sent in the past, his attitude was extremely arrogant in the presence of the emperor and ministers of the Jin Kingdom. Compared with his attitude now, it was like the difference between cloud and mud. And the reason for all these changes was very clear in their hearts. The Qi Kingdom and the Zhao Kingdom had repeatedly invaded the border. Each time, they were beaten back by the generals and soldiers of the Jin Kingdom. After losing several cities, the Zhao Kingdom finally calmed down and quietly retreated. The envoy who was sent to discuss the redemption of those cities was still hanging in the office of the Chamberlain of Dependencies. The envoys of the Qi Kingdom got straight to the point. After a few ceremonial words, they went straight to the point. The gist of it was that the Jing Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom were neighbors. How many people would die and how much money would be wasted if they were to fight each other all the time? How much money would be wasted? How about the two kingdoms shake hands and make peace from now on? They would respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, not invade each other's territory, and not interfere with each other's internal affairs. They would be equal and mutually beneficial, and they would coexist peacefully. As soon as he said this, not only did Emperor Jing stand up from his throne, but the court was also in an uproar. The biggest foreign threat of the Jing Kingdom was the Qi Kingdom. The two kingdoms had been fighting for decades, and the Jing Kingdom was the weaker one. Over the past decades, the Qi Kingdom had asked for peace several times, paying a heavy price for it. This time, it was the Qi Kingdom's turn to ask for peace. This was the first time. As the subjects of the Jing Kingdom, their hearts were filled with a sense of belonging and pride. Had the Jing Kingdom of today grown to the point that even the Qi Kingdom dared not underestimate it? Without waiting for the subjects of the Jing Kingdom to say anything, the leader of the envoys bowed and stepped forward. He said in a loud voice, "To show our sincerity, on behalf of the Crown Prince of the Qi Kingdom, we ask His Majesty the Emperor to marry the eldest princess of your kingdom. We also promise that after the Crown Prince ascends to the throne, we will immediately confer the title of Imperial Concubine to Her Highness." As soon as he said this, the court, which had been a little noisy, immediately quieted down. Someone was startled for a moment, then frowned. Some people were stunned at first, and then their faces showed a look of wild joy. Li Yi looked at the envoy who was holding the letter of credence from the Qi Kingdom, then raised his head to look up. The old emperor frowned. Her Highness the Princess was expressionless. She retracted her gaze, and there was not much change in her expression. Someone immediately stepped forward and said bluntly, "Your Majesty, we can negotiate for peace, but the Crown Prince of the Qi Kingdom must never marry the eldest princess." "I second the motion. I second the motion." As soon as Prime Minister Qin said this, many people in the court stepped forward. The Qi Kingdom taking the initiative to negotiate for peace was, of course, a very honorable thing to do. If word of this got out, it would raise the prestige of the kingdom. But for the Crown Prince of the Qi Kingdom to marry the eldest princess, it would be a fool's dream. The importance of Her Highness the Princess to the Jing Kingdom was self-evident. It could even be said that although she was a princess, she played the role of a monarch. Moreover, she was a wise monarch that was rarely seen in decades. Without Her Highness the Princess, what would become of the imperial court of the Jing Kingdom? Normal people would not do such a thing to give such a wise monarch to the Qi Kingdom for nothing. As for negotiating for peace, the Qi Kingdom did not want to discuss it. After all, they could not defeat the soldiers of the Jing Kingdom who had celestial punishment. In short, peace could not be discussed, but marrying the princess was out of the question. Cui Qingming looked at the old man who stepped forward. His expression was calm, but his fists were tightly clenched in his sleeves. He tilted his head to look, and an official stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, if the two countries go to war, how many people will be plunged into misery and suffering? How many brave soldiers of the Jing Kingdom will be sacrificed? Now that the Qi Kingdom has proposed to negotiate for peace, it is a blessing for the people. I hope that your Majesty will reconsider." After this official spoke, many people stepped forward to agree. Both sides stuck to their own views and argued endlessly. Emperor Jing put down the letter of credence and pressed his hand down. The imperial court immediately returned to silence. "We can negotiate for peace, but don't mention the marriage proposal again," he said plainly, showing his most obvious attitude. The envoy of the Qi Kingdom raised his head and said, "Negotiating for peace is a matter that benefits both countries. The Qi Kingdom has shown enough sincerity. Your country should also show some sincerity, right?" As soon as he said this, All the officials in the imperial court looked at the envoy of the Qi kingdom with unfriendly gazes. The envoy of the Qi kingdom was implying that if the Jing kingdom did not marry the eldest princess to the Jing kingdom and did not show enough sincerity, then there was no need to discuss the peace. Your Majesty, this matter is beneficial to the people. Please reconsider. Your Majesty, don't let the people be plunged into misery and suffering again. Your Majesty, please think of the people of the Jing kingdom and the soldiers at the front line. When a few more people stepped forward, Emperor Jing frowned and looked at a certain place below. He stepped forward at the right time and looked at those people. He asked, accepting the Qi kingdom's negotiation for peace and marrying the eldest princess to the Jing kingdom is to save millions of people and prevent the people from being plunged into misery and suffering. The leader of the group scoffed coldly and said, if it can prevent the war between the two countries, why not? Then, in the end, can it be avoided? He looked at him and then at the people around him. He asked again, the Jing kingdom and the Qi kingdom have negotiated for peace so many times. Did they really achieve what this lord said? The official was speechless. If negotiating for peace was really useful, it would have been enough to negotiate for peace once. The envoy of the Qi kingdom would not have appeared in the hall now. Li looked at the courtiers in the hall and said, everyone knows that the Qi kingdom has the heart of a tiger and a wolf. They have abandoned the treaty more than once. What credibility do they have? Moreover, your Majesty is ill and the eldest princess is assisting you in ruling the country. This is a critical time. How can you marry the Qi kingdom? Moreover, the crown prince of the Qi kingdom has lost the support of the people and may not even be able to sit on the throne. What right do you have to make such a promise? You're right. Old General Shuo laughed and walked out. He said, sincerity? What sincerity do you want? Do you want Tianfa? Another old general walked out and laughed. He said, the Qi kingdom is the invader. What's there to talk about negotiating for peace? If you want to retreat, do it quickly. If you want to fight, the soldiers of the Jing kingdom will not be afraid of you. Prime Minister Shun stood out and nodded. He said, your Majesty, I think Dr. Li is right. The Minister of War, Yin Bing, stepped forward and said, I agree. The Minister of Revenue, Qin Huan, stood beside him. I agree. The Minister of Left Minister, Dong Wenyun. Those who stepped forward were all important courtiers in the imperial court. The two prime ministers had the same opinion. The Shun family and the Wang family were also standing behind Jinzi Guanglu. The opinions of others were actually insignificant. Cui Qingming looked at the row of people standing in front of him. He clenched his fists so tightly that his nails dug deep into his palms. Soon, he loosened his fists helplessly. Regarding the negotiation for peace with the envoy of the Qi kingdom, the opinions of the big shots in the imperial court were unanimous. Peace could be negotiated, but marrying the eldest princess was out of the question. If it worked, they could negotiate. If it didn't work, they could get out. The Qi kingdom was still the Qi kingdom of the past, but the Jing kingdom was no longer the weak Jing kingdom of the past. Li ate a mouthful of egg fried rice. He looked at the eldest princess and said, you are right. The negotiation for peace with the envoy of the Qi kingdom is fake. They want to use this opportunity to get the help of the Jing kingdom to help the eldest prince ascend the throne. Mingzu held the wine cup, but she didn't eat. She didn't seem to be in a good mood. She looked at him and asked, what do you think about the peace marriage? Li thought for a while and said, peace marriage. Discord is moral integrity. Peace is also a diplomatic method. As for how I think about it, it can't be generalized. This is what you usually use to fool father. Mingzu swirled the wine cup and said, I want to listen to your heart. Heart. Li raised his wine cup and clinked it with her. He said without hesitation, I don't care if it's the Qi kingdom or the Zhao kingdom. Of course, I won't let you marry them. Chapter 881. The emperor and ministers of the Jing kingdom had firmly rejected the proposal of the envoy from the Qi kingdom. There was no hesitation, which meant that there was no room for negotiation. The eldest princess was not only the eldest princess. She also knew many secrets of the Jing kingdom, including Tianfa, which could not be known to outsiders. These secrets could never be leaked to the Qi kingdom. Not to mention that the current situation in the court depended on the princess. Without the eldest princess, the construction of the academy would come to a standstill. The implementation of the marriage policy would also encounter huge obstacles. The envoy from the Qi kingdom did not propose any more peace talks. The morning court session ended on bad terms. After returning to the office of the Grand Herald, he was not in a hurry to leave, as if he still had a glimmer of hope. As the current leader of the Cui family, Cui Qingming's face darkened the moment he stepped out of the palace. The envoy from the Qi kingdom is seeking peace with the intention of marrying the eldest princess. This is an opportunity that we cannot miss. We cannot let it go like this. After hearing the news, a man from the Cui family walked out anxiously and said hurriedly, "Li Yi, this kid, has already grown up." Cui Qingming pressed his palm heavily on the table and murmured, "You didn't see the scene in the court today. Just relying on the remaining power of our Cui family in the court is no longer enough to contend against him." But as soon as the man spoke, someone hurried in and said, "There is news from the palace. Her ladyship sent a message." Cui Qingming stood up and looked at the lady official who walked into the room with everyone else. The lady official glanced at Cui Qingming and the others. There was no expression on her face. She said calmly, "Her ladyship asked me to ask you, Lord Cui, what are you waiting for?" Cui Qingming clenched his fists. After a while, he nodded and said, "Tell her ladyship that I know what to do." The 6-month-old Li Duan was already restless. Although he could not walk, he could already turn over on his own. He could even walk when supported by an adult. Li Yi planned to build a carriage for the child to learn how to walk. It should be ready in 2 months at most. And Mingzhu Li is going to be married off to the Qi kingdom. When he was sketching in the room, Mississippi Lu suddenly walked in and asked out of the blue. Li Yi raised his head to look at her, then lowered his head and asked casually, "Who told you that?" Mississippi Lu walked over and took a look. She stood aside and said, "It's just a rumor." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Don't worry, she won't marry anyone who marries to the Qi kingdom. Even if she wants to, she can't. No one in the imperial court will agree to it." Mississippi Lu crossed her arms and murmured, "A 19-year-old princess should have married long ago." Li Yi raised his head and looked at her in surprise. "If I remember correctly, you seem to be a few days older than her, right?" Mississippi Lu turned to look at him and nodded. "You're right. So what are you trying to say?" "I told you. My memory can't be wrong." Li Yi lowered his head and continued to draw the blueprint. He murmured, "It's good that she's older. It's good that she's older." After drawing the blueprint, the next thing to do was to make and polish it. The finished product still needed to be tested and adjusted, but these could be left to the craftsman. If it wasn't for Mississippi Lu's reminder, Li Yi wouldn't have realized that she was already 19 years old. Even Xiao Huan had crossed the threshold of 17 years old. She was much more sensible and was about to become a young lady. Only that Sundra Lolita was still the same as when they first met. It seemed that she hadn't changed at all. She was still as playful as before. She could even play with the 6-month-old Li Duan. This also saved her and Rui a lot of trouble. Li Yi walked into the room and saw the little fellow lying on his back on the bed. The Sundra Lolita was lying by the bed, blinking her big eyes and looking curiously at the even smaller thing in the little fellow's split pants. Finally, at a certain moment, she couldn't help but reach out and pull it. County Magistrate Lu supported his chin with one hand. There was a thick file in front of him, but his mind wasn't on it. His eyes were blurred. His upper and lower eyelids touched each other and quickly opened again. In the past month, more than 10 cases of missing women had attracted the attention of the higher-ups. They had strictly ordered him to solve the cases within a time limit. However, a few days had passed, and there was no news of those thieves. He hadn't slept for a day and a night since last night. "Your Excellency, good news, good news." Seeing a Yamen runner running in from outside with a face full of surprise, County Magistrate Lu quivered. He immediately stood up and asked, "Is there any progress in the case?" The Yamen runner shook his head and said, "It's the young master's appointment. The young master has been hired by the Ministry of Revenue." County Magistrate Liu waved his hand weakly. The officials of the Ministry of Revenue had already discussed this matter with him. After that, good-for-nothing boy entered the mathematics college. He was enlightened and graduated with excellent grades. He didn't lose face for County Magistrate Liu. This time, he went to the Ministry of Revenue to temper himself, so he didn't need to worry about his future anymore. He waved his hand and said, "I see. You can go now." He was so sleepy that he lay on the table and planned to rest for a while. Not long after he closed his eyes, a thunderous voice rang in his ears again. "Your Excellency, good news." County Magistrate Liu patted the table and didn't even bother to open his eyes. He said, "Okay, I see. You can go now. I'll sleep for a while." After lying on the table and closing his eyes for a while, he felt a little refreshed. He picked up the file and was about to read it. Seeing that the Yamen runner was still standing below, he asked, "Anything else?" "Your Excellency, what should we do next?" County Magistrate Liu frowned and said, "What next?" "Detective Zhao has found some clues about the missing woman. He came back to ask you for your opinion." "When did you find it?" County Magistrate Liu suddenly stood up from his seat and asked, "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" The Yamen runner was stunned and said, "Didn't you say that you already knew?" County Magistrate Liu had been worried about this matter these days. There was progress in the case, but they didn't tell him immediately. What if, during this period of time, something happened? He glared at the Yamen runner and said, gritting his teeth, "Say it." The Yamen runner trembled and immediately said, "Thanks to your guidance, we followed your method and narrowed the scope of the secret investigation. As expected, we found some problems in a place outside the city. Great Scholar Sun has studied scriptures all his life. Although he isn't as good as Qin, he still has unique insights in some aspects. He is far away from the downtown area and lives in a hut outside the city. It took you a lot of effort to find him. Go now." Chu Ping bowed respectfully and said, "I'll take my leave." Ping Er's leg. Watching Chu Ping limp away, the middle-aged man stood beside Grand Tutor Chu and sighed. "That's a human life, a living human life." Grand Tutor Chu watched Chu Ping leave and shook his head. "And he only injured one of his legs from kneeling. I only hope that he can remember this lesson and not repeat the same mistake." The middle-aged man nodded and said, "He has been studying wholeheartedly these days. He has always been aware of his mistakes and has the intention to change." As soon as he finished speaking, a servant from the Chu family came to report that Shui Qingming from the Chui family had come to visit. Chapter 882. Grand Tutor. The Qi Kingdom has taken the initiative to seek peace. This has never happened since the founding of the country. Once we stop fighting the Qi Kingdom, our Jing Kingdom will be able to take this opportunity to recuperate and grow stronger. In the Chu household, Chui Qingming's face was full of excitement, but it suddenly turned fierce. But that scoundrel harbors evil intentions and has bewitched His Majesty. Even Prime Minister Qin and Prime Minister Shan, the old generals, and many important ministers have been deceived by his flowery words. If we miss this golden opportunity, our losses will be immeasurable. Grand Tutor Chu sat in his seat with a calm expression. When Shui Qingming finished speaking, he looked at him and said calmly, "In my life, I have seen the Jing Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom seek peace 3 times. In the end, the way of the world is still the way of the world. There is always war ahead, and the Qi Kingdom's wild ambition will never be satisfied. But the weak have never had the right to negotiate. The enmity between the Jing Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom cannot be resolved with a peace treaty. The situation in the Qi Kingdom is chaotic now. We only need to sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight. There is no need to interfere. Moreover, a crown prince of the Qi Kingdom who has not ascended the throne cannot represent the Qi Kingdom. But I know what to do. You need not say more." Grand Tutor Chu picked up the teacup on the table. It was clear that he was sending the guest off. Chui Qingming swallowed the words he wanted to say. His expression returned to normal. He slowly rose and said, "This junior bids his farewell." He walked out the hall and walked back the way he came. Just as he was about to step out of the Chu household's gate, he heard hurried footsteps behind him. "Brother Chui, Brother Chui." A middle-aged man caught up with him and said, "My father has been in a bad mood these days. If he has said anything overboard, I hope Brother Chui will not take it to heart." "How could that be?" Chui Qingming smiled and said, "Grand Tutor has always been like this. How could I not know? Today, Grand Tutor's words have enlightened me. There are some things that I need to carefully think about." The middle-aged man was relieved. That's good. That's good." At the Chu family's entrance, Chui Qingming looked up at the nation's literary bones plaque. After a long while, he turned around and boarded the carriage. The coachman leaned against the carriage and lifted the curtain slightly. He whispered, "Second master, the Yaman's people seem to have found that place." Chui Qingming frowned. "So fast?" The man nodded and said, "Today, the constables sent by the government are already 5 miles away from that place. I'm afraid they will find us soon. We have to move as soon as possible." Chui Qingming lifted the curtains of the window and looked in the direction of the Chu family again. He leaned against the carriage and said faintly, "If they want to investigate, then let them go to the capital governor's manor." The coachman lowered the curtain and said in a low voice, "I understand. Outside the capital, in a certain village, in front of the grass at the village entrance." Chu Ping bowed slightly to the white-haired old man in front of him. "Many thanks to Great Scholar Sunday. Today, with Great Scholar Sun's guidance, Chu Ping has benefited greatly. The younger generation will surpass us in time. The younger generation will surpass us in time. We are old now. The future belongs to you young people." The old man stroked his white beard and said, "Send my regards to the Grand Tutor. I will pay a visit another day. I bid you farewell, elder. I won't be sending you off." Chu Ping walked all the way to the village entrance. There were already people waiting there. A well-dressed young man stretched out his hand and pointed at the carriage beside him. He smiled and said, "Master Chu, please." On a high hill outside the village, a constable was lying in the grass. He put away the cylindrical object in front of him and furrowed his brows. They had been following that carriage all day, but from the logo on it, it belonged to a small noble family in the capital. This matter was a bit troublesome to deal with. He turned his head and said in a low voice, "Keep a close watch here. I will go back and report to the master." At the same time, in the capital governor's manor, Sung Shichen put down his teacup and looked at Chui Qingming. "You don't have to worry about that woman. To prevent her from causing trouble outside, I have already locked her up in prison. As long as we find a reason, she can be locked up like this." Chui Qingming nodded and said, "The matter I mentioned just now, don't worry. I will also have people keep a close eye on that place. There won't be any delays. This matter is very important. I will leave it to Brother Tsung." Sung Shichen looked at him and said solemnly, "Brother Chui can rest assured that I will handle this matter. Bide your time." Li Yi crumpled a piece of paper into a ball and threw it into the lake. He didn't quite understand the 4 words that Sung Shichen had sent him. The arrival of the Qi Kingdom's envoy to the capital was a great opportunity that couldn't be more obvious. Inciting public opinion, colluding with the court officials to force the abdication of the throne, pressuring the emperor, and so on. With a whole set of gifts, the Chui family and their accomplices were almost finished. But if others didn't make a move, it wouldn't be good for him to make the first move. In this way, Lord Sung's words of "bide your time" seemed a little out of the blue. He didn't finish his words, and this half was unclear and vague, which was really annoying. Her Royal Highness threw a stone at the lake, leaving a long mark on the surface of the lake. It flew to the other side and disappeared. She asked casually, "This time, what other reason can they think of?" Li imitated her and threw a stone. The stone sank into the lake with a thud. "I don't know." He shook his head and thought for a moment. Suddenly, he said, "Why don't we be a little more ruthless?" And Mingzi looked at him and asked, "How ruthless?" Li pointed at the ripples on the surface of the lake and said, "Take advantage of the quiet night, when the moon is dark and the wind is strong, and send a few masters to kidnap Chui Qingze, Chui Qingming, and a few other important figures of the Chui family." And then, Li Yi threw another stone into the lake. Mingze looked at the ripples on the surface of the lake and asked, "What if Grand Tutor Chu stands out and opposes?" Another thump came from the surface of the lake. "Noble consort Chui?" Thud. "What about all the opposing officials in the court and all the people in the world?" "Then forget it." He shook his head and lay on the lawn with his hands behind his head. He sighed and said, "In this way, the fish in this lake can't be eaten in the future. Therefore, this kind of thing couldn't be rushed. Her side still had to take the righteous side and basically could only rely on the other side to court death. This was very passive and not easy. As a friend, he did this for her. If she didn't reward him with a very, very high official title in the future, even the heavens wouldn't be able to bear it. Mingze knew that he was just joking. She imitated him and lay on the lawn with her hands behind her head, looking at the blue sky. At this moment, all the heavy court affairs seemed to be completely erased from her mind like the cloudless sky. Li Yi turned sideways and was about to say something. His mouth opened halfway and his whole body froze. When she lay on the lawn with her hands behind her head, the clothes on her chest tightened, revealing a seductive curve. The two of them were very close to each other. Because of the perspective, at this moment, Li Yi couldn't tell who was the winner between her and Mississippi Liu in the small pavilion in the lake, Li Xian sighed. He always felt that there was something between Li Yi and Mingze that he didn't know besides the love between a man and a woman. Unfortunately, the two of them denied it every time. He couldn't get any useful information from either of them. Beside him, the proud Lolita held her chin with her hands and looked in the same direction as him. She also sighed slowly. Chapter 883. What happened to the Peng family? Hearing Detective Zhao's words, County Magistrate Liu frowned and said, "He's just a county magistrate. How can he handle such a big thing?" Detective Zhao asked tentatively, "Then I'll take some people to the Peng family now. Wait a minute." County Magistrate Liu waved his hand and said, "Don't rush. Don't alert the enemy before there is conclusive evidence. A small noble was still a noble with a title of nobility. If it was the Peng family, it would be fine. Not to mention a county magistrate. Even a duke would not be able to handle it. But if it was not the Peng family, it would be really troublesome to frame a noble for no reason." While he was thinking about it, a runner suddenly came to report that people from the capital government had arrived. County Magistrate Liu looked up and saw the leading official. He cupped his hands and said, "Lord Han." "Lord Liu." Lord Han cupped his hands and returned the greeting. Then he asked directly, "Is there any progress in the case of the missing girls?" County Magistrate Liu looked at him and nodded. He said, "There is some progress. We can almost determine where those girls were taken." "That's good." The man showed a hint of joy on his face and said, "Our superiors are pressing us, and the government is also under great pressure. Since you have found it, you should take action immediately and close the case as soon as possible, so as not to cause more trouble." County Magistrate Liu frowned and said, "But this case involves a county magistrate." Lord Han waved his hand and said, "So what? He is a county magistrate. He has committed such a heinous crime, and he can't escape the punishment of the law." He turned around and waved to a runner. "Go to the government and get more people here. Today, I will make sure that none of them can escape." County Magistrate Liu saw this and said no more. It was also a good thing for them to close the case earlier. The two governments took action at the same time. Naturally, the battle formation could be described as mighty. The constables of the government were in front, and the county magistrate followed. They quickly went out of the city gate. Everyone spread out. Don't gather together. Surround the Peng family from all sides. Lord Han said that no one can escape today. After the leader gave the order, everyone immediately dispersed. In a manor somewhere outside the capital, the guards at the entrance stood lazily, chatting with each other. "Say, Who do you think went just now? To think that the second young master would personally accompany him. Who knows? One of them shook his head and said, but it must be a big shot in the city. Why do you think these big shots? Maybe those big shots like this. They tried all kinds of things. It's inevitable that they want to try something new. Don't you think so? The person on the left said, but didn't get an immediate response from the person next to him. When he turned his head, he saw a knife pressed against the person's neck. A look of terror appeared on his face, and he was just about to scream when he felt a cold sensation on his neck. Don't talk. Lead the way. As the cold voice fell, there were noisy footsteps in the surroundings. The two Yamans had sent out dozens of bailiffs for this serious case. Although the Peng family had many guards and servants, they didn't dare to resist the officials. How could they resist? In a short period of time, everyone was chased into the courtyard. A few bailiffs entered the inner courtyard and kicked open a door. When they saw the injured woman tied up in the room, their faces were filled with anger. Put her down first, the leader of the bailiffs said. Immediately, two bailiffs walked over, untied the woman, and wrapped her in a blanket. Inside the room, the naked man was so scared that he couldn't even speak properly. He said in a trembling voice, What are you doing? The bailiffs picked up the whip beside him and whipped him in the face. He said angrily, Put him on and take him away. At the same time, the sound of doors being kicked open could be heard from every room in the inner courtyard. In the corner, a few bailiffs kicked open the door and rushed in. When they saw the man in the room, they were startled and blurted out, Young Master Chu, why? It's you again. Chu Ping looked back and threw the burning candle in his hand to the ground. He looked at the door indifferently. The bailiff's expression changed and immediately said, Quick, close the door. The case of the missing women that had attracted a lot of attention in the capital had finally been solved. After the women were kidnapped, they were forced into prostitution by the Peng family just to satisfy some perverted animal desires. When the Yamen bailiffs found the Peng family, there were still many people in the room who were doing the beastly things. They were caught on the spot and put on black hoods. They were stuffed into carriages and sent to the Yamen. The abused women were immediately sent to the Women's Medical Center for treatment. Watching the carriages leave, one bailiff said indignantly, We were the ones who worked hard these days. In the end, the credit was taken by the Yamen. Why? Shut up. Someone beside him tugged at his arm and said, Are you blind? Those people who were brought out just now are clearly not ordinary people. Do you think our master would be willing to do something like this? The bailiffs came to his senses. When he walked through a few rooms, he saw a few familiar faces. They were clearly some of the foppish young masters who often appeared in the capital. His master really couldn't afford to offend the powers behind these people. He clenched his fists tightly, but in the end he could only sigh and say, Damn it, I still don't feel good. The banquet of the Chu family had already begun. The middle-aged man looked at the empty seat below and said in confusion, Strange, it's already so late. Why hasn't Pinger returned yet? Grand Tutor Chu said calmly, There are many things about Sun Zhongxiu that he can learn from. It's fine for him to come back later. The middle-aged man nodded and said, Pinger has been working much harder than before. Just as he finished speaking, a servant ran in frantically and said in fear, Master, there's a letter from the capital Yamen. Something big has happened. Something big has happened. The middle-aged man frowned and said, Just what happened? Tell me slowly. The servant handed over a piece of paper. After the middle-aged man finished reading it, he suddenly stood up from his seat and flipped over his chair. The dining table also shook violently. Soup splattered everywhere, and countless chopsticks fell to the ground. His face was pale. He gripped the paper tightly and murmured, Unfilial son, unfilial son. Grand Tutor Chu slowly stood up and looked at him. He said, Give me the letter. The middle-aged man held the letter, and a hint of hesitation appeared on his face. Give me the letter. Grand Tutor Chu repeated. Hearing this, the middle-aged man could only respectfully hand over the letter. Grand Tutor Chu took the letter. At first, his expression was rather calm. However, not long after, his breathing began to quicken, and he gripped the letter tightly. His eyes were bloodshot, and his beard was trembling incessantly. The middle-aged man hurriedly walked over and gently patted his back. He said hurriedly, "Father, Father, calm down, calm down. Don't be angry and harm your health. Bastard, the descendants of the Chu family have been upright for generations. How could we have produced such a bastard?" After a sorrowful voice, the middle-aged man cried out anxiously, "Father, Father, someone, quickly go get a doctor." Chapter 884. That bastard. Where is that bastard now? Grand Tutor Chu had already woken up before the doctor arrived and asked in a trembling voice. The servant replied in a trembling voice. The magistrate's office said that they did not reveal young master's identity. They should be sending young master home soon. As soon as he finished speaking, a servant announced that Lord Zeng and Lord Shui had come to visit. In the distance, a few figures walked over. At the very front were two middle-aged men, and behind them was Chu Ping, who was limping over. "Lord Grand Tutor, kneel." Chui Qingming had just opened his mouth when he was shocked by the furious Lord Grand Tutor and swallowed the words he wanted to say. Plop! Chu Ping was expressionless as he knelt on the bluestone. "Bastard! How did our Chu family produce such a bastard like you?" Grand Tutor Chu's expression was somewhat ferocious as he raised his walking stick and fiercely struck Chu Ping's shoulder. "This old man will beat you to death today, so that my Chu family's ancestors won't be humiliated." Chu Ping's body swayed, but he did not dodge. A cold smile appeared on his face as he said, "Then beat me to death. I'm a cripple anyway. It's a stain on the Chu clan's reputation. It's better if I die. Death is the end of all troubles." Grand Tutor Chu was stunned as he looked at the grandson he had raised since he was a child. He found that after only a few months, he actually did not recognize him. He raised his walking stick, but did not lower it for a long time. He murmured, "My Chu family has 100 years of good reputation, 100 years of good reputation, 100 years of good reputation." A bitter smile appeared on Chu Ping's face. "Yes, 100 years of good reputation. As long as you beat me to death, the Chu family will still be the Chu family. The Chu family that is praised by everyone will not lose 100 years of good reputation." He stretched his head out and smiled. "Come, grandfather, I'm ready." Grand Tutor Chu looked at him, his body trembling. The walking stick in his hand could not be lowered. Ping, he put down his walking stick and bent down, using his withered hands to caress Chu Ping's face. His old eyes were filled with tears as he said in a trembling voice, "Pinger, how did you become like this?" Chu Ping didn't reply. A pained expression appeared on his face, and he closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were devoid of emotion. He stood up from the ground, and without giving Grand Tutor Chu another glance, he limped back inside. The middle-aged man behind Grand Tutor Chu stepped forward, looked at Zeng Shichen, and asked anxiously, "Lord Zeng, what is going on?" Zeng Shichen shook his head and said, "Today the magistrate's office received news that many cases of women going missing in recent days were committed by the Peng family of Pinggan County. They kidnapped these women and forced them into prostitution in order to satisfy some perverted hobbies of some guests. When the constables broke the door and entered, they happened to see Chu Ping inside. The middle-aged man still had some disbelief and muttered, "This is impossible. This is impossible. Didn't Pinger go to visit Great Scholar Sun? Didn't he go ask Great Scholar Sun for guidance? How? How could—" "Brother Chu, young people will inevitably make mistakes." Chui Qingming waved his hand and said, "Even the king of Shu was temporarily expelled from the capital by his majesty because of a small mistake made by a young man. Nephew Chu Ping is still young. Although he has followed the Grand Tutor through thousands of mountains and rivers, he has truly experienced too little and is easily tempted by external things. In the future, with strict discipline, he will definitely correct his mistakes and become good again." The middle-aged man sighed and said, "I will have to trouble Brother Chui with this matter." Chui Qingming smiled and said, Brother Chu, do not worry. No one knows that Chu Ping is also involved in this matter. As for other obstacles, Lord Sung will also help clear them away, just like last time. Thank you, Brother Chui. The middle-aged man said, then turned his head to look at Grand Tutor Chu and said, Father, I will go see Ping. After seeing the middle-aged man leave, Chui Qingming took a step forward and said, Grand Tutor, Chu Ping is still young. It is inevitable that he will make mistakes. Don't be angry, bang. Chui Qingming held his head as fresh blood flowed down his forehead. He stared in a daze at Grand Tutor Chu and said with some disbelief, Grand Tutor Chui Qingming. Grand Tutor Chu's eyes were bloodshot. He used his walking stick to point at him from a distance and said, My eyes can't see clearly. Do you think my heart is also blind? Chui Qingming held his head and looked at Grand Tutor Chu. After a long time, the shock on his face disappeared. With a calm expression, he said, What is Grand Tutor saying? Why can't I understand? Grand Tutor Chu threw his walking stick to the ground and glanced at him with a cold gaze. In a cold voice, he said, Get out. It seems that I have outsmarted myself. As the two of them walked out of the Chu household, Tsang Shichen looked at Chui Qingming and said in a small voice, How can this be considered as outsmarting myself? The wound on Chui Qingming's head was no longer bleeding. However, there was still a lot of blood on his face. When he smiled, he looked rather ferocious and terrifying. Tsang Shichen shook his head and asked, From the looks of it, Grand Tutor probably already knows that you are behind all this. Will he still help the Chui family and His Highness the King of Shu? He is not helping the Chui family, nor is he helping His Highness the King of Shu. Chui Qingming wiped the blood off his head and said, He is helping the Chu family. Tsang Shichen looked at him and said, Hand over Chu Ping, and the Chu family will still be the Chu family. Chui Qingming shook his head and said, Before today, hand over Chu Ping, and the Chu family will still be the Chu family. After today, the Chu family's reputation for 100 years will be in our hands. As for the choice, Grand Tutor is a smart man. He will know what to do. Father, what should we do? In the dark great hall, the person in charge of the Chu family on the surface walked in and looked at the figure in the depths of the darkness. After a long time, a hoarse voice came from the darkness. How is Ping? He has already fallen asleep, the middle-aged man replied. No sound came from the darkness. I was wrong. I was wrong from the very beginning. After a long time, a sigh came from the darkness. The old man muttered, I didn't expect the Chui family to be so vicious. Those are living human lives, living human beings. The middle-aged man looked at him in a daze, his face filled with disbelief. Father, you mean they have already destroyed Ping and now they want to destroy our Chu family? The old man slowly turned his head and looked at the ancestral tablets of the Chu family in the darkness. He muttered, They want to destroy the reputation that our Chu family has built up over generations. The middle-aged man's body trembled as he said anxiously, Father, you mustn't. You mustn't. The Chu family's reputation for 100 years must not be destroyed in our hands. He gritted his teeth and said with great difficulty, If it really doesn't work, then hand over Ping. Grand Tutor Chu shook his head and said, After they sent Ping back twice, this is no longer Ping O's problem. The middle-aged man took a few steps back and muttered, Could it be that our Chu family? Grand Tutor Chu lit the candles in the room and straightened his clothes. He said, Make preparations. In a few days, I will be meeting a few old friends that you're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.